350 million years ago, the world looked nothing like the one you know. There were no birds singing in the canopy. There were no flowers blooming in meadows. There were no grasses, no prairies, no fruit-bearing trees. The continents themselves were arranged in patterns that would be utterly unrecognizable on any modern map. And yet, in this alien world, something was happening that would shape every single aspect of the civilization you live in today. Forests were rising. Not forests like the ones you might walk through on a weekend hike, not forests of oak and maple and pine, but forests unlike anything that has existed before or since. Towering, cathedral-like, dripping with moisture, humming with the wings of insects the size of hawks, these forests were engines of transformation on a planetary scale. They were pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere in staggering quantities. They were pumping oxygen into the air until the very chemistry of breathing changed. They were laying down layer after layer after layer, the compressed remains of their own dead, building up deposits of organic material so vast, so dense, so energy-rich that hundreds of millions of years later, an entirely different kind of creature would dig them up, set them on fire, and use them to power an industrial revolution. This is the story of the Carboniferous period, a span of roughly 60 million years, from 359 million years ago to 299 million years ago. It is the story of the age when forests conquered the earth, when the atmosphere itself was remade, when the ground beneath your feet was being filled with the fuel that would one day drive turbines, heat homes, and reshape human history. It is a story of creation and collapse, of evolutionary innovation and ecological catastrophe, of a world that built itself into something extraordinary and then slowly, inexorably came apart. And it begins, as so many great stories do, with something very small. To understand what made the Carboniferous period so remarkable, you first have to understand what came before it. The period that immediately preceded the Carboniferous is called the Devonian, and it is sometimes referred to as the Age of Fishes, because during that time the oceans were dominated by an extraordinary diversity of fish species, from the armored placoderms with their bony plates and crushing jaws to the first lobe-finned fish that were beginning, tentatively, to explore the margins of the land. But the Devonian was also an age of botanical revolution. It was during the Devonian that plants first began to truly colonize the terrestrial surface of the earth in a meaningful way. Before the Devonian, land plants existed, but they were humble things. Imagine small, low-growing mats of green, clinging to the edges of streams and the shores of shallow seas. They had no true roots, no true leaves, no vascular tissue capable of transporting water and nutrients over any significant distance. They were limited to moist environments where they could absorb water directly through their surfaces. They could not grow tall, they could not spread into drier habitats. They were in a very real sense prisoners of the water's edge. But during the Devonian, everything changed. Plants evolved vascular tissue, the internal plumbing system of tubes and channels that allows water to be drawn up from the soil and distributed throughout the body of the plant. This was a revolution. Vascular tissue, plants could grow taller. They could develop true roots that penetrated deep into the ground, anchoring them and accessing water that surface-dwelling organisms could never reach. They could develop true leaves, flat, broad surfaces optimized for capturing sunlight and carrying out photosynthesis. And most importantly, with vascular tissue, plants could evolve something that would change the world forever. They could evolve wood. Wood is, at its most basic, a form of structural support. It is made primarily of two substances, cellulose, which provides flexibility, and lignin, which provides rigidity. Lignin is the key. It is a complex organic polymer, a tough, resilient molecule that is extraordinarily difficult to break down. When plants evolved lignin, they gained the ability to build rigid, self-supporting structures that could reach heights previously unimaginable for any land-dwelling organism. And in the Devonian, that is exactly what they did. The first true forests appeared. Trees like Archaeopteris, which could reach heights of 30 feet or more, spread across the landscape, their roots digging into the soil, their branches reaching toward the sky, their leaves drinking in the sunlight. But these Devonian forests were just the prologue. They were the opening act, the first tentative steps of a process that would reach its full, breathtaking expression in the period that followed. Because when the Devonian ended, roughly 359 million years ago, and the Carboniferous began, the world was poised on the edge of something truly extraordinary. The stage was set, the players were in position, and the great age of forests was about to begin. The Carboniferous period gets its name from the Latin word for carbon, and for good reason. This is the period in Earth's history that produced the vast majority of the world's coal deposits. Coal, as you probably know, is a fossil fuel. It is the compressed, chemically altered remains of ancient plant material, and the sheer volume of coal that was laid down during the Carboniferous is staggering. When geologists first began to study the thick, black seams of coal that run through the rock layers of Europe and other continents, they realized that these deposits represented something almost beyond comprehension. The accumulated remains of forests so vast, so productive, and so long-lived that the dead plant material they generated could not be consumed, could not be decomposed, could not be recycled back into the ecosystem. Instead, it simply piled up year after year, century after century, millennium after millennium, until it formed layers of organic material dozens of feet thick. These layers were then buried by sediment, compressed by the weight of the rock above them, heated by the geothermal energy of the Earth's interior, and slowly, over millions of years, transformed from soft, spongy peat into hard, dense, energy-rich coal. But why? Why did so much plant material accumulate without decomposing? Why did the normal processes of decay and recycling break down so spectacularly during the Carboniferous? To answer that question, we need to look at three things: the geography of the Carboniferous world, the nature of the plants that dominated it, and the strange, fateful absence of a biological process that we take completely for granted today. Let us begin with geography. 350 million years ago, the arrangement of the continents was radically different from what it is today. The major landmasses of the Earth were in the process of converging, drifting slowly toward one another, driven by the relentless churning of the mantle beneath them. The supercontinent of Pangaea had not yet fully assembled, but its formation was well underway. The southern continents, what would eventually become South America, Africa, Antarctica, Australia, and India, were joined together in a massive landmass called Gondwana, which was positioned over the South Pole. The northern continents, the ancestors of modern Europe and North America, were separate but drawing closer, drifting through the tropics. And it is the position of these northern landmasses that matters most for our story. During the early Carboniferous, large portions of what would become the northern continents were situated directly on or very near the equator. This equatorial position meant that these regions received enormous amounts of solar energy year-round. They were hot, they were humid. And critically, they were low-lying. Much of the equatorial landmass during the Carboniferous was barely above sea level. In many areas, the land was so flat, so close to the water table, that it was essentially a vast, continuous swamp. Imagine a landscape stretching for thousands of miles, a landscape where there was no clear boundary between land and water, where shallow seas merged into coastal marshes, which merged into freshwater swamps, which merged into flooded lowland forests. The ground was perpetually waterlogged. Rivers meandered lazily across the flat terrain, their channels shifting constantly, depositing sediment in broad, fan-shaped deltas. The air was thick with humidity. Rain fell frequently and heavily. And in this warm, wet, endlessly flat world, conditions were absolutely perfect for the growth of plants. The equatorial position provided abundant sunlight. The warm temperatures kept growing seasons long, or even eliminated the concept of seasons altogether. The waterlogged soil provided a constant supply of moisture, and the flat terrain meant that water pooled and lingered rather than draining away, creating a continuous mosaic of wetland habitats that stretched across enormous areas of the Earth's surface. These were the Carboniferous coal swamps, and they were unlike anything that exists on Earth today. The closest modern analog might be the swamp forests of Southeast Asia or the peat bogs of the boreal regions, but even these comparisons fall short. The Carboniferous coal swamps were larger, wetter, more productive, and more ecologically uniform than any wetland ecosystem in the modern world. They were factory floors for photosynthesis, vast biological machines that converted sunlight and carbon dioxide into organic matter on a scale that is difficult to fully grasp. And the plants that filled these swamps were something truly special. When you think of a forest, you probably picture trees with thick, woody trunks, spreading branches, and broad leaves, oak trees perhaps, or maples, or towering conifers with their needle-like foliage. These are seed plants, and they are the dominant trees of the modern world, but in the Carboniferous, seed plants were newcomers. They existed, certainly. They were evolving and diversifying, particularly in drier, upland habitats. But the great swamp forests of the Carboniferous were not dominated by seed plants. They were dominated by a group of organisms that in the modern world are represented by small, humble, easily overlooked plants that grow close to the ground in damp, shady places. They were dominated by lycopsids. If you have ever walked through a moist forest and noticed small, creeping plants with tiny, scale-like leaves growing on the forest floor, you may have been looking at a modern lycopsid. Club mosses, quillworts, these are the living descendants of the great Carboniferous lycopsids, and they are modest organisms. A large modern club moss might reach a height of a foot or two. Most are much smaller. They are inconspicuous, unassuming, the kind of plants that most people walk past without a second glance, but their ancestors were giants. The lycopsids of the Carboniferous coal swamps were among the largest plants that have ever lived. Species like Lepidodendron and Sigillaria could reach heights of 100 feet or more. Their trunks could be 3 feet or more in diameter at the base, and they rose straight and columnar like the pillars of some vast, organic cathedral. Their bark was covered in a distinctive diamond-shaped pattern of leaf scars, the marks left behind by the small, scale-like leaves that grew directly from the trunk during the tree's youth and were shed as it grew taller. When you see fossilized bark from a lepidodendron, the pattern is immediately recognizable, a repeating, almost geometric design that looks as though it were carved by a sculptor rather than produced by nature. But here is the thing about the giant lycopsids, the thing that made them so different from modern trees, the thing that would have such profound consequences for the Earth's atmosphere and climate. Despite their enormous size, they were not really like modern trees at all, not on the inside. Modern tree, an oak or a pine, is solid wood. Its trunk is made of dense, structural tissue, layer upon layer of cellulose and lignin laid down over decades or centuries. When you cut through a modern tree trunk and count the annual rings, you are counting years of slow, steady growth, each ring representing a season of wood production. A modern tree grows slowly, adding a thin layer of new wood each year, and it may take centuries to reach its full height. The giant lycopsids did not work this way. They grew fast, staggeringly fast by the standards of modern trees. Estimates suggest that a lepidodendron could reach its full height of 100 feet in as little as 10 to 15 years. This is an astonishing growth rate. And the reason they could grow so fast is that they were not solid wood in the way a modern tree is solid wood. The trunk of a lepidodendron had only a thin outer rind of wood, a cylinder of dense, structural tissue perhaps only a few inches thick. The interior of the trunk was filled with softer, less dense tissue, more like the pith of a modern herbaceous plant than the heartwood of an oak. The lycopsid was in essence a hollow pillar, a tube of bark, and a thin layer of wood wrapped around a core of soft tissue. This design was in some ways brilliantly efficient. It allowed the tree to reach enormous heights with a minimal investment of the costly, energy-intensive structural material that is wood. It allowed rapid growth, which was advantageous in the competitive, light-hungry environment of the swamp forest, but it also meant that the tree was not particularly long-lived by the standards of modern trees. A lepidodendron probably lived for only a few decades at most, a mayfly by the standards of an oak or a sequoia, and when it died, something remarkable happened. Or rather, something remarkable failed to happen. In a modern forest, when a tree dies and falls to the ground, it is quickly colonized by a vast army of decomposers. Fungi send their thread-like hyphae into the dead wood, secreting enzymes that break down cellulose and lignin into simpler compounds. Bacteria join in, attacking the softer tissues. Insects bore into the wood, chewing tunnels and galleries, breaking it into smaller pieces that are more accessible to microbial attack. Worms, mites, springtails, and a host of other invertebrates feed on the decaying material, breaking it down further. Within a few years, or at most a few decades, a fallen tree in a modern forest is reduced to a crumbling, spongy mass, and eventually to a dark smear of humus on the forest floor, its carbon released back into the atmosphere as carbon dioxide, its nutrients return to the soil where they can be taken up by living plants. This cycle of growth, death, decomposition, and nutrient recycling is fundamental to the way modern ecosystems work. It is so basic, so ubiquitous, that we tend to take it for granted. Dead things rot, that is simply what happens. But in the Carboniferous coal swamps, dead things did not rot, or rather, they did not rot completely. They did not rot efficiently. The great fallen trunks of the lycopsid trees, the shed leaves, the dropped branches, the tangled masses of roots, all of this organic material accumulated on the floor of the swamp forest, and it stayed there. It piled up. Layer upon layer, year after year, century after century, the dead plant material built up into thick deposits of waterlogged, partially decomposed organic matter. This material is called peat. If you have ever visited a peat bog in the modern world, you have seen something analogous to what was happening in the Carboniferous coal swamps, but on a vastly smaller scale. Peat is organic material that has begun to decompose but has not completed the process. It is dark, dense, spongy, and rich in carbon. In the modern world, peat forms in cool, wet environments where the cold temperatures and waterlogged, acidic conditions slow down decomposition. But in the Carboniferous, peat was forming in the tropics, in warm, wet environments where you would expect decomposition to be rapid and efficient. So why wasn't it? This is one of the most important questions in the entire history of the Carboniferous period, and the answer, as best we understand it, comes down to two factors working in concert. The first factor is water. The coal swamps were waterlogged. The ground was saturated. When organic material falls into standing water, it is cut off from the oxygen in the atmosphere, and most of the organisms responsible for decomposition, particularly fungi, require oxygen to do their work. In waterlogged anaerobic conditions, decomposition slows to a crawl. This is why peat bogs form in the modern world. The water prevents efficient breakdown of dead plant material. But water alone does not fully explain what happened in the Carboniferous. After all, there are waterlogged environments in the modern world, and while peat does form in them, it does not form at the extraordinary rates that characterized the Carboniferous coal swamps. Something else was going on, and this brings us to the second factor, the one that has captured the imagination of scientists and storytellers alike, the lignin problem. Remember lignin, the tough, rigid polymer that gives wood its strength. The molecule that allowed plants to grow tall, to build the structural framework of trunks and branches, to reach toward the sky and compete for light. Lignin is an extraordinary molecule. It is complex, irregular, and extremely resistant to chemical breakdown. In the modern world, the primary agents of lignin decomposition are a specific group of fungi known as white rot fungi. These fungi produce specialized enzymes, peroxidases, and laccases that are capable of attacking the chemical bonds in lignin and breaking the molecule apart. Without these enzymes, lignin is essentially indestructible by biological means. No other group of organisms, not bacteria, not animals, not other types of fungi, can break down lignin with anything approaching the efficiency of white rot fungi. And here is the critical point, the hinge on which the entire story of the Carboniferous turns. There is strong evidence that white rot fungi had not yet evolved during the Carboniferous period. Or if they had evolved, they had not yet developed the full suite of enzymes necessary to efficiently decompose lignin. This hypothesis, which was proposed by researchers studying the molecular evolution of fungal enzymes, suggests that there was a lag, a gap of tens of millions of years, between the evolution of lignin by plants and the evolution of the enzymatic machinery needed to break lignin down. Plants evolved lignin during the Devonian, roughly 400 million years ago. But the white rot fungi capable of efficiently decomposing lignin did not appear until near the end of the Carboniferous or possibly even the beginning of the Permian, roughly 300 million years ago. Think about what this means. For a period of perhaps 60 million years, plants were producing vast quantities of lignin, building it into their trunks, their roots, their branches, and when those plants died, nothing could effectively break that lignin down. The cellulose could be decomposed slowly by bacteria and by the more primitive fungi that were present during the Carboniferous. But the lignin, the structural backbone of the wood, resisted decomposition. It accumulated, it persisted. It piled up in the waterlogged swamps, forming thicker and thicker layers of partially decomposed plant material, rich in carbon, resistant to further breakdown. This was the fundamental mechanism that drove the formation of coal. The plants captured carbon from the atmosphere through photosynthesis, converting carbon dioxide into the organic molecules that built their bodies. When they died, that carbon should have been returned to the atmosphere through decomposition, completing the carbon cycle. But because decomposition was incomplete, because the lignin could not be broken down, a significant fraction of that carbon was not returned. Instead, it was buried, locked away in accumulating layers of peat that would eventually, over millions of years, be compressed and heated into coal. The implications of this process were profound. With each passing year, each passing century, each passing millennium, carbon was being removed from the atmosphere and sequestered in the ground. The concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere began to drop. And as carbon dioxide dropped, two things happened. The climate began to cool because carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas, and with less of it in the atmosphere, less heat was being trapped. And the concentration of oxygen in the atmosphere began to rise because the same photosynthetic process that removes carbon dioxide from the air also releases oxygen. The stage was being set for one of the most extraordinary atmospheres in the history of the planet. To appreciate just how unusual the Carboniferous atmosphere was, you need to know what the atmosphere is like today. In the modern world, the air you breathe is roughly 78% nitrogen, 21% oxygen, and about 0.04% carbon dioxide, with trace amounts of other gases. That 21% oxygen level is what your body is adapted to. It is what your lungs are designed to process, what your hemoglobin is optimized to carry, what your cells expect to receive. During the Carboniferous, oxygen levels were significantly higher. Estimates vary, and there is ongoing scientific debate about the exact figures, but most models suggest that atmospheric oxygen during the peak of the Carboniferous reached at least 30%, and some estimates go as high as 35%. This is not a small difference. An atmosphere with 35% oxygen is a fundamentally different chemical environment than one with 21%. It changes the rules of physics and biology in ways that are both subtle and dramatic. The most immediate effect of elevated oxygen is on combustion. Fire requires three things: fuel, heat, and oxygen. In an atmosphere with higher oxygen content, fires start more easily, burn more intensely, and are harder to extinguish. Some researchers have suggested that the Carboniferous forests must have experienced frequent, devastating wildfires, and indeed, the fossil record contains abundant evidence of charcoal in Carboniferous sediments, indicating that fire was a regular feature of these ecosystems. But the persistent wetness of the coal swamps may have provided a counterbalance, with the waterlogged conditions preventing fires from becoming too destructive in the lowest, most productive parts of the ecosystem, while allowing fires to burn in drier, upland areas. The second effect of elevated oxygen is on biology, and this is where the story becomes truly astonishing. If you have ever seen a dragonfly, you know that it is an impressive insect. Modern dragonflies are agile, fast, and beautiful, with wingspans that can reach 4 or 5 inches in the largest species. They are among the most effective aerial predators in the insect world, catching mosquitoes and other small flying insects on the wing with a success rate that would make a hawk envious. Now imagine a dragonfly with a wingspan of 2.5 feet. This was Meganeura, and it was real. Its fossils have been found in Carboniferous and early Permian deposits, and they are among the most spectacular insect fossils ever discovered. Meganeura was not technically a true dragonfly. It belonged to a related but distinct group called the Meganiciptera, or griffinflies, but it looked and behaved much like a dragonfly. It was an aerial predator, cruising through the forest canopy on broad, membranous wings, hunting other insects and possibly small vertebrates. A wingspan of 2.5 feet. In an insect, this requires explanation because in the modern world, insects do not get this large. The largest living insects, certain stick insects and beetles, are impressive, but they are nowhere near the size of Meganeura. What allowed Carboniferous insects to grow so large? The answer, or at least a major part of the answer, lies in the way insects breathe. Insects do not have lungs. They do not breathe the way you do, pulling air into a pair of large, centralized organs where gas exchange takes place. Instead, insects breathe through a system of tiny tubes called tracheae. These tubes open to the outside of the body through small pores called spiracles, and they branch and subdivide throughout the insect's body, delivering oxygen directly to the tissues. It is an elegant system, but it has a fundamental limitation. It relies on passive diffusion. Oxygen diffuses into the tracheal tubes from the outside air and then diffuses through the tubes to reach the cells. And diffusion is a slow process. The farther oxygen has to diffuse, the less efficiently it is delivered. This means that there is a physical limit to how large an insect can grow, because beyond a certain body size, the tracheal system simply cannot deliver oxygen to the innermost tissues fast enough to keep them alive. But this limit is not fixed. It depends on the concentration of oxygen in the surrounding air. In an atmosphere with higher oxygen content, diffusion is more efficient because the concentration gradient that drives diffusion is steeper. More oxygen is available at the spiracle openings, and it diffuses more rapidly through the tracheal tubes. This means that in a high oxygen atmosphere, insects can grow larger before they hit the physical limit of their respiratory system. And that is exactly what happened during the Carboniferous. The elevated oxygen levels lifted the ceiling on insect body size, allowing arthropods to grow to dimensions that are simply impossible in the modern atmosphere. Meganeura was the most famous example, but it was far from the only one. The Carboniferous and early Permian fossil record is filled with oversized arthropods that thrived in the oxygen-rich air. There was Arthropleura, a millipede-like creature that could reach lengths of over 6 feet, making it one of the largest terrestrial arthropods that has ever lived. Imagine encountering this animal on the floor of the coal swamp, a segmented, many-legged creature the length of a car, pushing through the fallen debris of the forest floor. Arthropleura was probably a herbivore or detritivore, feeding on dead plant material or perhaps on living vegetation, but its sheer size is staggering. There were giant cockroaches, some with wingspans of several inches, scuttling through the undergrowth. There were scorpions of impressive size, eurypterids in the water, and a host of other arthropods that took advantage of the oxygen-rich atmosphere to push the boundaries of invertebrate body size. But the giant insects were only one consequence of the high oxygen atmosphere. The elevated oxygen levels had effects that rippled through every aspect of the Carboniferous world, influencing everything from the frequency and intensity of wildfires to the metabolic rates of animals to the chemistry of soils and sediments. The air itself was different. It was richer, denser with the molecule that powers aerobic life, and the creatures that breathed it were shaped by that difference in ways both obvious and subtle. Let us return now to the forests themselves, because we have not yet fully explored the extraordinary ecosystems that dominated the Carboniferous coal swamps. We have talked about the giant lycopsids, Lepidodendron and Sigillaria, and their strange, rapid growth patterns, but the lycopsids were not the only plants in the coal swamp. The Carboniferous forest was a complex, multi-layered ecosystem with a diversity of plant species occupying different niches and different levels of the forest structure. Beneath the towering canopy of the lycopsids, there was a secondary layer of smaller trees and tree-like plants. Among the most important of these were the tree ferns, members of a group called the marachals. Tree ferns are still around today. You can find them in the tropical forests of New Zealand, Southeast Asia, and South America, but during the Carboniferous they were much more diverse and abundant. Some Carboniferous tree ferns could reach heights of 40 or 50 feet, though most were smaller, forming a sub-canopy beneath the lycopsid giants. There were also plants called calamites, which were relatives of modern horsetails. If you have ever seen a horsetail, those slender, jointed, bamboo-like plants that grow in damp ditches and along stream banks, you have seen a diminutive version of a Carboniferous calamite. Modern horsetails rarely exceed a few feet in height, but the calamites of the Carboniferous could grow 30 or 40 feet tall, with segmented, hollow trunks and whorls of slender, needle-like leaves at each joint. They often grew in dense stands along riverbanks and at the margins of the deeper swamps, forming thickets that must have looked something like bamboo groves. At ground level, the forest floor was covered with a dense carpet of smaller ferns, club mosses, and other low-growing plants. The ground itself was soft, wet, and spongy, a thick mat of accumulated peat overlain by a thin layer of living vegetation. Water stood in pools and channels everywhere. The air was thick with humidity, and condensation dripped from every surface. Sunlight, filtered through the layers of foliage above, reached the forest floor as a dim, greenish glow. This was a world of vertical layers, each with its own community of organisms. In the canopy high above the swamp floor, the crowns of the lycopsids formed a broken, irregular ceiling of green. In the sub-canopy, tree ferns and calamites competed for the light that filtered down from above. On the forest floor, a carpet of low-growing plants covered the saturated peat, and beneath the surface, in the waterlogged soil, a tangle of roots spread outward from the bases of the great trees, anchoring them in the soft, unstable ground. The root systems of the lycopsids were remarkable in their own right. They are known as stigmaria, and for a long time, paleontologists found them as separate fossils without realizing they were connected to the giant lycopsid trunks above. Stigmarian roots spread horizontally through the shallow, waterlogged soil, extending outward in all directions from the base of the tree. They were not deep because the water table was so high that there was no need, and perhaps no possibility, for deep root penetration. Instead, they formed a broad, shallow mat that provided stability in the soft peat and absorbed water and nutrients from the saturated soil. The entire ecosystem was adapted to waterlogged conditions. The plants that dominated the coal swamps were specialists, organisms that had evolved over millions of years to thrive in a specific, demanding environment. They needed standing water, or at the very least, perpetually saturated soil. They needed the flat, low-lying terrain that allowed water to pool and persist. They needed the warm, equatorial climate that provided year-round growing conditions. They were supremely well-suited to the world they inhabited, and as long as that world persisted, they flourished beyond measure. But the very specialization that made them so successful would eventually become their greatest vulnerability. Let us take a moment to consider the sheer productivity of these ecosystems. Modern tropical forests are among the most productive ecosystems on Earth. They capture enormous amounts of solar energy and convert it into biomass at impressive rates. But the Carboniferous coal swamps may have been even more productive, at least in terms of the sheer quantity of organic material they generated. Consider the math. Each year, each hectare of coal swamp forest produced tons of new plant material: leaves, wood, roots, reproductive structures. In a normal ecosystem, most of this material would be decomposed within a few years, its carbon returned to the atmosphere, its nutrients recycled. But in the Carboniferous swamps, a significant fraction of this material was not decomposed. It accumulated as peat. And over millions of years, this peat built up into layers that could be dozens of feet thick. When you look at a coal seam in a mine or a cliff face, you're looking at compressed peat that has been squeezed by the weight of overlying sediment until most of the water has been driven out and the organic material has been concentrated into a dense, carbon-rich rock. A 1-foot layer of coal might represent 10 or 20 feet of original peat, which in turn represents thousands of years of plant growth and accumulation. A thick coal seam, the kind that made industrial mining economically viable, might represent tens of thousands of years of continuous peat accumulation, and there are coal seams that are extraordinary in their thickness and extent. Some of the great coal deposits that fueled the Industrial Revolution contain seams that are 10, 20, even 30 feet thick. These represent almost incomprehensible periods of sustained organic accumulation, thousands upon thousands of years during which the swamp forest grew, died, piled up, and was not consumed. The total amount of carbon that was locked away in Carboniferous coal deposits is staggering. It is enough to have measurably altered the composition of the Earth's atmosphere, drawing down carbon dioxide and driving up oxygen over the course of tens of millions of years. The coal swamps were not just ecosystems. They were geological agents, forces of planetary change, engines of atmospheric transformation. Now, we need to talk about what was happening in the rest of the world while the coal swamps were doing their extraordinary work in the equatorial lowlands. Because the Carboniferous was not just a story of forests and swamps, it was a story of a planet in transition, with changes happening on every continent and in every ocean. In the southern hemisphere, the great landmass of Gondwana was undergoing a very different kind of transformation. While the equatorial regions basked in tropical warmth, the southern continents were drifting over the South Pole, and they were experiencing something that the Earth had not seen in hundreds of millions of years: a major continental glaciation. During the late Carboniferous, ice sheets expanded across large portions of Gondwana, covering areas that would eventually become South America, Africa, India, Australia, and Antarctica. These ice sheets were massive, comparable in some cases to the ice sheets that covered the northern continents during the Pleistocene ice ages of the last few million years. Evidence of this glaciation is preserved in the rocks of these continents in the form of tillites, glacially deposited sediments containing a jumble of rock types and sizes, and in the form of glacial striations, scratches carved into bedrock by the movement of ice. The Carboniferous glaciation of Gondwana was one of the most significant ice ages in Earth's history, and its causes are intimately connected to the story of the coal swamps. Remember, the massive burial of organic carbon in the coal swamps was drawing down atmospheric carbon dioxide. With less carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, less heat was being trapped by the greenhouse effect. Global temperatures were dropping. And when you combine falling global temperatures with a large continental landmass positioned over the South Pole, you get the conditions necessary for the formation of continental ice sheets. So there is a connection, a direct causal link between the tropical swamp forests of the equatorial regions and the ice sheets of the southern continents. The forests pulled carbon out of the air. The reduction in atmospheric carbon dioxide cooled the planet. The cooling promoted the growth of ice sheets on the polar continent of Gondwana. It is a beautiful example of how different parts of the Earth system are connected, how changes in one region can have consequences that ripple across the entire planet. But the glaciation also had consequences that fed back into the equatorial regions. Ice ages are characterized not just by cold temperatures, but by fluctuating sea levels. When ice sheets grow, they lock up enormous volumes of water on land, and global sea levels drop. When ice sheets melt, that water returns to the ocean, and sea levels rise. This cycle of glaciation and deglaciation, of falling and rising sea levels, had a profound effect on the low-lying equatorial regions where the coal swamps were located. Remember, the coal swamps were situated on flat, low-lying terrain, barely above sea level. Even a small change in sea level could have dramatic effects. When sea levels dropped during periods of glacial expansion, new land was exposed at the margins of the continents, and the coal swamps could expand into these newly available areas. When sea levels rose during periods of glacial melting, the sea advanced inland, flooding the coastal swamps, killing the freshwater-adapted plants, and depositing layers of marine sediment on top of the peat. This cycle of flooding and exposure created a distinctive pattern in the rock record, a pattern that geologists call cyclones. A cyclone is a repeating sequence of rock layers that records one cycle of sea level rise and fall. A typical cyclone might include, from bottom to top, a layer of coal, representing a period of swamp forest growth and peat accumulation during low sea level, a layer of marine limestone or shale, representing a period of flooding and marine sediment deposition during high sea level, and another layer of terrestrial sediment, representing the next period of low sea level and the beginning of the next cycle. These cyclones are found throughout the Carboniferous rock record, and they tell a story of a world in constant flux, a world where the coal swamps were repeatedly drowned and re-established, where the boundary between land and sea shifted back and forth across the flat equatorial landscape in response to the waxing and waning of distant ice sheets. Each time the swamps were drowned, the standing forest was killed, and a layer of marine sediment was deposited over the peat. Each time the sea withdrew, new plants colonized the exposed surface, and peat accumulation resumed. This repeated cycle produced the stacked sequences of coal seams separated by layers of non-coal rock that are characteristic of Carboniferous coal measures around the world. It is a record of a dynamic, pulsating system, a world where the forces of geology and climate interacted to create a rhythmic pattern of growth and inundation. While we are considering the broader picture of the Carboniferous world, we should also talk about the animals. We have already discussed the giant insects, those spectacular products of the high oxygen atmosphere. But the Carboniferous was also a critical time for the evolution of vertebrate animals, and some of the most important events in the history of life on land took place during this period. The Carboniferous inherited from the Devonian a world where vertebrate animals had only recently made the transition from water to land. The earliest tetrapods, the four-limbed vertebrates that would eventually give rise to amphibians, reptiles, mammals, and birds, had first appeared during the late Devonian, roughly 375 million years ago. These early tetrapods were still closely tied to the water. They had evolved limbs from the fleshy, lobed fins of their fish ancestors, but they were essentially aquatic or semi-aquatic animals, probably spending most of their time in shallow water and only venturing onto land for short periods. During the Carboniferous, tetrapods diversified enormously. The warm, wet coal swamps provided ideal habitat for animals that were still dependent on water for reproduction and for keeping their skin moist. The swamps were teeming with food, insects, worms, other small invertebrates, fish in the waterways, and a rich growth of vegetation. The tetrapods radiated into a wide range of ecological niches, evolving a diversity of body forms and lifestyles. Many of the Carboniferous tetrapods were amphibians, or at least animals that we would broadly classify as amphibian-like. Some were small, salamander-like creatures that lived in the leaf litter and undergrowth of the swamp forest. Others were much larger, growing to impressive sizes. Some of the largest Carboniferous amphibians were predators that inhabited the waterways of the coal swamps, lurking in the shallow, murky water like living crocodiles, waiting for prey to come within reach of their wide, tooth-studded jaws. But the Carboniferous also saw the emergence of a new kind of tetrapod, a kind that would eventually come to dominate the land in ways that the amphibians never could. This was the lineage that would give rise to the reptiles. The key innovation that separated the reptiles from their amphibian ancestors was the amniotic egg. Amphibians, like their fish ancestors, reproduce by laying their eggs in water. Amphibian eggs are soft, jelly-like, and vulnerable to desiccation. They must be laid in water or in very moist environments, and the larval stage of many amphibians, the tadpole, is fully aquatic. This reproductive strategy ties amphibians to the water. No matter how well adapted an adult amphibian may be to life on land, it must return to water to breed. The amniotic egg changed everything. It is a self-contained, closed system, a little package of everything an embryo needs to develop on land. It has a tough, semi-permeable shell that prevents water loss while allowing gas exchange. It has a yolk sac that provides nutrition. It has membranes that manage waste and protect the developing embryo. With the amniotic egg, vertebrates were freed from the water for the first time. They could lay their eggs on dry land, far from any pond or stream, and the embryo would develop successfully inside its protective shell. The earliest known reptile, or more precisely one of the earliest known amniotes, is a small animal called Hylonomus, whose fossils were found inside the fossilized stumps of lycopsid trees. Picture this, a small, lizard-like animal, perhaps 8 inches long, sheltering inside the hollow stump of a fallen lepidodendron tree. It was probably an insectivore, hunting the abundant arthropods of the coal swamp. It was not large or impressive. It did not dominate its ecosystem, but it carried within its biology the potential for something extraordinary. The amniotic egg meant that this small, unassuming animal and its descendants would eventually be free to colonize habitats that amphibians could never reach, to spread into the dry interiors of continents, to diversify into dinosaurs and mammals and birds, and all the other astonishing forms that amniotes would eventually take. During the Carboniferous, however, reptiles were still in their infancy. They were small, relatively uncommon, and confined mostly to the drier margins of the coal swamp ecosystem. The swamps were still the domain of the amphibians and the giant insects, The reptiles were waiting in the wings, evolutionary understudies preparing for a role that would not come to prominence until the next act of the geological drama. Let us now step back and consider the longer arc of the Carboniferous period, because this was not a static world. The conditions that prevailed during the early and middle Carboniferous did not last forever. The planet was changing, slowly but relentlessly, and those changes would eventually bring the age of the coal swamps to an end. The Carboniferous period is typically divided by geologists into two sub-periods. The earlier half is called the Mississippian in some geological traditions, or the early Carboniferous, and it spans from roughly 359 to 323 million years ago. The later half is called the Pennsylvanian or the Late Carboniferous, spanning from 323 to 299 million years ago. The Great Coal Swamps were primarily a phenomenon of the Late Carboniferous. The Pennsylvanian, though some coal formation did occur during the earlier period. During the Late Carboniferous, the coal swamps reached their peak extent and productivity. This was the zenith, the high noon of the age of forests. The equatorial wetlands stretched across thousands of miles of low-lying terrain, and the lycopsid forests pumped out biomass at extraordinary rates. Atmospheric oxygen climbed to its Carboniferous peak. Carbon dioxide reached some of its lowest levels since the Cambrian. The Gondwanan ice sheets waxed and waned in response to orbital cycles, driving the rhythmic sea level changes that created the cyclones. But beneath this apparent stability, forces were at work that would fundamentally alter the world. The continents were still moving. The collision between the northern and southern landmasses was continuing, and it was building mountains. Great mountain ranges were rising at the suture zones where continents were grinding together. These mountains, which would eventually become the central ranges of Pangaea, had far-reaching effects on the climate and geography of the equatorial regions. First, the mountains altered atmospheric circulation patterns. As the mountains rose, they blocked and deflected the flow of moist air, creating rain shadows, regions on the downwind side of the mountains that received significantly less rainfall. Areas that had once been drenched in tropical moisture began to dry out. The perpetual wetness that the coal swamp plants required began to falter. Second, the assembly of Pangaea changed the distribution of ocean currents. As the continents merged into a single supercontinent, the ocean circulation patterns were reorganized, and this had effects on the distribution of heat and moisture around the globe. Third, and perhaps most importantly, as the continents continued to merge and the geography of the equatorial regions changed, the vast, continuous lowland swamps that had been the home of the coal forests began to break apart. The flat, low-lying terrain was disrupted by tectonic uplift, by the deposition of sediment from the rising mountains, by changes in river drainage patterns. The formerly continuous swampland became fragmented into isolated pockets, separated by drier, higher ground. For the lycopsid trees, this fragmentation was catastrophic. These were specialists, organisms that depended on specific, demanding environmental conditions. They needed standing water. They needed saturated soil. They needed the flat, continuous terrain that allowed water to pool and persist. When the swamps began to break apart, the lycopsids had nowhere to go. They could not adapt to drier conditions because their entire biology, their rapid growth, their shallow root systems, their reproductive strategies was built for the swamp. As their habitat shrank, their populations declined. They did not go extinct immediately, but their dominance was broken. The decline of the lycopsid forests did not happen overnight. It was a slow, gradual process that played out over millions of years, a slow diminishment rather than a sudden collapse. And it was not a uniform process. In some areas, the swamps persisted longer than in others. In some regions, coal formation continued well into the late Carboniferous and even into the early Permian. But the overall trend was clear. The coal swamps were shrinking and the world was changing. As the lycopsids declined, other groups of plants began to fill the ecological vacuum. The tree ferns, which had always been present in the coal swamps as secondary components of the ecosystem, became more prominent in some areas. But the real beneficiaries of the lycopsid decline were the seed plants, the gymnosperms. Gymnosperms, a group that includes modern conifers, cycads, and ginkgos, had been evolving throughout the Carboniferous, but they had been largely confined to the drier, upland habitats at the margins of the coal swamps. They were not swamp plants. They were adapted to conditions that were drier, more seasonal, more variable than the perpetual wetness of the lowland swamps. They reproduced by means of seeds, which were a significant advance over the spore-based reproduction of the lycopsids and ferns. Seeds are, in many ways, the botanical equivalent of the amniotic egg. A seed contains a dormant embryo, a supply of nutrients, and a protective coat, everything needed for the next generation to survive the trip from parent to germination site. Unlike spores, which are tiny, fragile, single-celled structures that require moist conditions to germinate and develop, seeds can survive dry conditions, can remain dormant for extended periods, and can germinate when conditions become favorable. This made seed plants far more versatile than their spore-bearing competitors. They could colonize habitats that lycopsids and ferns could not reach. They could survive periods of drought that would kill a lycopsid. They could spread into the newly available, drier habitats that were opening up as the Carboniferous world changed. The rise of the gymnosperms during the late Carboniferous and early Permian was one of the most important botanical transitions in the history of life. It marked a shift from a world dominated by swamp-adapted, spore-bearing plants to a world dominated by versatile, drought-tolerant, seed-bearing plants. It was a shift that would endure in various forms for the next 250 million years, until the evolution of flowering plants in the Cretaceous period added yet another chapter to the story of botanical succession. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Let us return to the Carboniferous and consider in more detail what daily life was like in the coal swamp forest at the height of its glory. Imagine for a moment that you could step through a portal in time and find yourself standing in a Carboniferous coal swamp roughly 310 million years ago. What would you see? What would you hear? What would you feel? The first thing you would notice is the heat. This is the equatorial tropics and the temperature is high, probably in the upper 80s or low 90s Fahrenheit, but it is not a dry heat. The humidity is staggering, close to 100%. The air is so thick with moisture that breathing feels like drinking. Every surface glistens with condensation. Water drips from the canopy above in a constant, gentle rain even when no actual rain is falling. The light is strange. You are standing in a forest, but it is not like any forest you have ever seen. The canopy above you, formed by the crowns of the giant lycopsids, is far overhead, perhaps 80 or 90 feet above the forest floor. But it is not a dense, closed canopy like the canopy of a modern tropical rainforest. The lycopsids had relatively sparse crowns, with branches mainly at the top of their tall, columnar trunks. The light that filters through is green and diffuse, creating an underwater quality, as though you were standing at the bottom of a very deep, very warm, very green swimming pool. The ground beneath your feet is soft and yielding. You are standing on peat, a thick mat of partially decomposed plant material that has the consistency of a wet sponge. If you push down with your foot, water wells up around your shoe. In some places, you can feel the ground quivering beneath you, shifting and settling as the soft peat compresses under your weight. Water stands in pools and channels everywhere, dark, tannin-stained water the color of strong tea, reflecting the green canopy above. The trunks of the lycopsid trees rise around you like the columns of some vast, organic cathedral. Each trunk is 3 or 4 feet in diameter at the base, and it rises straight up without branching for 60 or 70 feet before the first branches appear at the crown. The bark is covered in that distinctive diamond-shaped pattern of leaf scars, each scar marking the point where a small, scale-like leaf was once attached before being shed as the tree grew taller. If you run your hand over the bark, it feels rough and scaly, like the skin of a reptile. Between the lycopsid trunks, smaller trees compete for space and light. Tree ferns rise 20 or 30 feet, their graceful, feathery fronds unfurling from tightly coiled fiddleheads at their growing tips. Calamites stand in clusters near the water's edge, their jointed, segmented trunks looking for all the world like bamboo stems, their whorls of narrow leaves rustling in any slight movement of the air. At ground level, the vegetation is dense and tangled. Small ferns cover every available surface, their delicate fronds spreading across the peat and climbing up the bases of the tree trunks. Club mosses, the small relatives of the giant lycopsids, creep across the forest floor in tangled mats. Strange, seed fern-like plants, not true ferns at all despite their fern-like foliage, grow in the slightly drier spots, their fronds reaching toward the dim light above. And the insects are everywhere. The air hums with the sound of wings. Dragonfly-like griffinflies patrol the spaces between the trunks, their enormous wings catching the filtered light as they bank and turn. Smaller flying insects swarm in clouds, their bodies catching the light like motes of dust. On the tree trunks, cockroaches the size of your hand scuttle up and down the bark, their antennae twitching constantly. In the leaf litter at your feet, millipedes and centipedes push through the decaying vegetation, their many legs rippling in coordinated waves. Some of these millipedes are startlingly large, their bodies as thick as your wrist, their segmented armor gleaming dully in the green light. In the water, things move. Fish, descendants of the ancient Devonian lineages, patrol the channels and pools. Amphibians lurk at the water's edge, some small and salamander-like, others larger and more crocodilian in their habits. You might see the flat head and wide mouth of a large temnospondyl, a predatory amphibian breaking the surface of a pool, its eyes watching you with the cold, patient gaze of a hunter. And somewhere in the hollow of a fallen lycopsid stump, a small, lizard-like animal, an early reptile, peers out at the world with bright, alert eyes, its tiny claws gripping the soft wood, its throat pulsing as it breathes the rich, oxygen-laden air. This is the Carboniferous coal swamp at its zenith. It is alien. It is beautiful, it is extraordinary, and it is, even now, slowly dying. The death of the coal swamps was not a dramatic event. There was no asteroid impact, no supervolcanic eruption, no sudden catastrophe that wiped out the forests in a geological instant. Instead, the end came gradually, a slow squeeze of changing conditions that tightened year by year, century by century, until the specialized organisms of the coal swamps could no longer hold on. We have already discussed the tectonic forces that were driving this change. The assembly of Pangaea, the rise of mountains, the alteration of atmospheric and oceanic circulation patterns, the fragmentation of the lowland swamp habitats. But there were other factors at play as well. The climate was becoming more seasonal. In the early Carboniferous, the equatorial regions had experienced a relatively uniform climate year-round, with consistent warmth and consistent moisture. But as the Carboniferous progressed, the climate began to develop more pronounced seasonal variations. Dry seasons appeared, periods when rainfall diminished and water levels in the swamps dropped. For the lycopsid trees, which needed constant moisture, even brief dry seasons could be devastating, killing seedlings, stressing adults, and opening gaps in the forest canopy that were filled not by new lycopsids, but by the more drought-tolerant seed plants that were waiting at the margins. The glacial cycles also played a role. The waxing and waning of the Gondwanan ice sheets caused sea levels to rise and fall repeatedly, and each cycle of flooding disrupted the coal swamp ecosystems. In the earlier Carboniferous, the swamps had been resilient enough to re-establish themselves after each flooding event. But as the overall trend shifted toward drier, more seasonal conditions, each recovery was a little less complete, each re-established swamp a little smaller, a little more fragmented than the one before. And there may have been a biological factor as well. Remember the white rot fungi, the organisms that could break down lignin. The evidence suggests that these fungi were evolving during the late Carboniferous, developing the enzymatic tools they needed to attack the tough, resistant molecule that had been accumulating in the peat for millions of years. As white rot fungi became more effective at decomposing wood, the rate of peat accumulation would have slowed. More carbon would have been returned to the atmosphere through decomposition, reducing the net rate of carbon burial. This would have had cascading effects on the atmosphere and climate, potentially contributing to the changes that were already underway. The transition from the Carboniferous to the Permian, around 299 million years ago, was not a sharp boundary in most respects. Life did not undergo a sudden, dramatic shift at the stroke of the geological clock. Rather, the trends that had been developing throughout the late Carboniferous continued and intensified in the early Permian. The coal swamps continued to shrink, the lycopsids continued to decline, the gymnosperms continued to diversify and spread, the climate continued to become drier and more seasonal. The ice sheets of Gondwana continued to wax and wane, though they too would eventually diminish as the Permian progressed and global temperatures began to rise again. But the world that emerged from the Carboniferous was fundamentally different from the world that had entered it. The atmosphere had been remade. The oxygen levels, though they would eventually decline, had been elevated to extraordinary heights. The carbon dioxide levels had been drawn down to some of their lowest values in hundreds of millions of years. The continents had been rearranged, the biological communities of the land had been transformed, and beneath the ground, buried under layers of sediment, the compressed remains of the Carboniferous forests lay in silent darkness, their carbon locked away, their energy stored, waiting. They would wait for a very, very long time. Let us take a deeper look at the reproductive biology of the Carboniferous plants, because it tells us something fundamental about why the transition from lycopsids to gymnosperms was so significant, and why it matters for understanding the broader trajectory of life on Earth. The lycopsids, like all their spore-bearing relatives, reproduce through a two-stage life cycle that biologists call alternation of generations. In this life cycle, the familiar, large, visible plant, the tree that you see when you walk through the forest, is the sporophyte generation. It produces spores, tiny, single-celled reproductive units that are released into the environment. When a spore lands in a suitable location, it germinates and grows into a gametophyte, a small, often inconspicuous plant that produces the actual sex cells, the eggs and sperm. The sperm must swim through a film of water to reach the egg, and when fertilization occurs, the resulting embryo grows into a new sporophyte, a new tree. This life cycle works well in wet environments. In a coal swamp, where water is everywhere, there is always a film of moisture available for the sperm to swim through. Reproduction is reliable and efficient. But take this organism out of the swamp, put it in a drier environment where surface water is intermittent or absent, and the system breaks down. Without water, the sperm cannot reach the egg. Without fertilization, there are no new sporophytes. The reproductive cycle grinds to a halt. This is why the lycopsids were prisoners of the swamp. Their entire reproductive biology was dependent on the presence of external water. They could not colonize dry land, not because they lacked the structural ability to grow there, but because they could not reproduce there. The seed plants solved this problem. In seed plants, the male gametophyte is reduced to a microscopic structure called a pollen grain, which is carried to the female gametophyte not by swimming through water but by wind, or in later evolutionary lineages, by animals. The female gametophyte is retained within the body of the parent plant, protected from desiccation. When the pollen grain reaches the female gametophyte, fertilization occurs internally, without any need for external water. The resulting embryo is then packaged into a seed, a tough, resistant structure that can survive harsh conditions and germinate when circumstances are favorable. This was a profound innovation. It freed the reproductive process from its dependence on water. It allowed seed plants to reproduce in any environment, wet or dry, tropical or temperate. It opened up the entire terrestrial surface of the earth to colonization by seed-bearing plants. And during the late Carboniferous, as the coal swamps began to shrink and the climate began to dry, this freedom became an enormous competitive advantage. The early gymnosperms of the late Carboniferous were not large or dominant trees. Many of them were shrubby or vine-like plants that grew at the margins of the swamps or in the drier upland areas between the swamp basins, but they were versatile. They could grow where the lycopsids could not, and as the world changed around them, that versatility became the key to the future. We should also consider in more detail the structure and ecology of the Carboniferous waterways, because the coal swamps were not just forests. They were aquatic ecosystems as well, with a rich and diverse community of organisms living in the water that permeated every part of the landscape. The rivers and streams of the Carboniferous lowlands were slow-moving and meandering, winding across the flat terrain in broad, lazy loops. They carried heavy loads of sediment, which they deposited in levees and floodplains, building up the flat topography that characterized the coal swamp landscape. The water was warm, shallow, and rich in dissolved organic matter from the surrounding peat, giving it a dark, tea-like color. These waterways were home to a diverse community of fish. Among the most common were the paleoniscoids, small, scaled fish with elongated bodies and large eyes, the ancestors of the ray-finned fishes that dominate the modern freshwater ecosystems. There were also lungfish, which had the remarkable ability to breathe air using a modified swim bladder, an adaptation that allowed them to survive in the stagnant, oxygen-poor waters of the swamp. Lungfish are still around today, living in seasonal wetlands in Africa, South America, and Australia, and their presence in the Carboniferous tells us that conditions in the swamp waterways were probably similar to those in modern tropical wetlands: warm, shallow, and sometimes dangerously low in dissolved oxygen. Sharks, too, were present in the Carboniferous waterways, though not the large, oceanic sharks that most people think of when they hear the word. Carboniferous freshwater sharks were typically small, specialized predators that had adapted to life in rivers and swamps. Some had unusual dental structures, with teeth arranged in bizarre, spiral-like configurations that paleontologists are still debating the function of. The most famous of these is Helicoprion, though this genus actually lived a bit later, in the Permian. Still, its Carboniferous relatives were present and represent the diversity of cartilaginous fishes in these ancient waterways. The invertebrate life of the waterways was equally diverse. Freshwater bivalves and gastropods crawled along the muddy bottoms. Crustaceans of various kinds scuttled through the shallow water. Aquatic insects, including the larvae of the giant griffinflies, hunted in the warm, dark pools, and of course the amphibians. The waterways were the domain of the amphibians, many of which were fully aquatic or semi-aquatic. Some were small, eel-like creatures that lived permanently in the water, never venturing onto land. Others were large, powerful predators that ambushed their prey from the shallows. The diversity of Carboniferous amphibians was remarkable, far greater than the diversity of modern amphibians, and it reflects the abundance and richness of the aquatic habitats that the coal swamps provided. Now let us consider a topic that is often overlooked in discussions of the Carboniferous, but is absolutely essential to understanding the period: the soil. Before the Devonian, there was essentially no soil on Earth, at least not in the sense that we use the word today. Soil, as we know it, is a complex mixture of mineral particles, organic matter, water, air, and living organisms. It is a product of the interaction between rocks, climate, and life. Without plants and the organisms that depend on them, there is no organic matter to mix with the mineral particles, no roots to break up the rock, no earthworms and fungi and bacteria to create the rich, structured matrix that we call soil. The first soils began to form during the Devonian, as plants colonized the land and their roots began to break up the surface rocks. But these early soils were thin, poorly developed, and limited in extent. It was during the Carboniferous that soils truly came into their own, as the great forests spread across the landscape and their root systems penetrated deep into the substrate. The roots of the Carboniferous trees did more than just anchor the plants. They actively broke up the underlying rock, a process called biological weathering. As roots grew into cracks and crevices in the rock, they exerted physical pressure that widened those cracks and fractured the rock into smaller pieces. The roots also released organic acids and other chemicals that dissolved minerals from the rock, a process called chemical weathering. Together, these processes broke the hard, consolidated rock at the surface into the loose, fragmented material that forms the mineral component of soil. As the roots broke up the rock, they also added organic matter to the developing soil. Dead roots shed bark, fallen leaves, all of this material mixed with the mineral particles, creating a fertile matrix that could support a diverse community of soil organisms. Bacteria, fungi, protists, and small invertebrates colonized the soil, breaking down organic matter, recycling nutrients, and creating the complex, structured ecosystem that we find in modern soils. The development of deep, fertile soils during the Carboniferous had profound implications. Soils regulate the flow of water across the landscape, absorbing rainfall and releasing it slowly into streams and rivers. Soils store nutrients, making them available to plants over long periods. Soils provide habitat for an enormous diversity of organisms. And soils play a critical role in the carbon cycle, storing carbon in their organic matter and influencing the rate at which carbon is transferred between the land, the atmosphere, and the oceans. The Carboniferous was, in a very real sense, the period when the Earth acquired its skin. The thin, lifeless mineral surface that had characterized the planet for billions of years was transformed into a living, breathing, dynamic layer of soil that covered the continents and regulated the planet's biogeochemical cycles. This transformation was driven by the forests, and it was one of their most enduring legacies. Let us turn our attention now to another aspect of the Carboniferous world that deserves close examination: the role of fire. We have already noted that the high oxygen levels of the Carboniferous atmosphere would have made fires easier to start and more intense once started, and the fossil record confirms this. Carboniferous sediments contain abundant fusing, a type of fossil charcoal that is produced when plant material is burned. The presence of fusing throughout the Carboniferous rock record tells us that wildfires were a regular feature of these ancient ecosystems, but the relationship between fire and the coal swamp forests was complex. The waterlogged conditions of the swamp floor would have made fires unlikely in the lowest, wettest parts of the ecosystem. Peat is notoriously resistant to burning when it is saturated with water. So the fires that did occur were probably concentrated in the drier, upland areas, on the levees and ridges that rose above the general level of the swamp, and in the upper canopy where the foliage was exposed to the air and could dry out enough to burn. Fire may have played an important ecological role in the coal swamp ecosystem, clearing dead material, opening gaps in the canopy, releasing nutrients from accumulated organic matter, and creating opportunities for new growth. In this sense, fire in the Carboniferous may have functioned much as it does in modern fire-adapted ecosystems like pine savannas and Australian eucalyptus forests, as a regular, natural disturbance that helped to maintain the structure and diversity of the ecosystem. But the high oxygen levels also meant that when fires did occur, they could be extraordinarily intense. A fire burning in an atmosphere with 30% or more oxygen generates more heat, spreads faster, and is harder to extinguish than a fire burning in the modern atmosphere. Crown fires, in which the flames leap from treetop to treetop without ever touching the ground, may have been common. These intense fires could have been devastating to the forest, killing trees over wide areas and producing massive quantities of charcoal that were washed into the swamps and incorporated into the peat deposits. The interplay between fire and the coal swamp ecosystem is a fascinating area of ongoing research, and it highlights the complex, interconnected nature of the Carboniferous world. The forests produced the oxygen that fueled the fires. The fires consumed some of the forest biomass, returning carbon to the atmosphere and potentially limiting the buildup of oxygen. The waterlogged conditions of the swamp protected the peat from burning, preserving the carbon stores that would eventually become coal. It was a system of checks and balances, a dynamic equilibrium that maintained itself for millions of years. As we approach the midpoint of our story, let us pause to consider the sheer scale of what the Carboniferous forests accomplished, because it is easy to lose sight of the big picture amid the details of lycopsid anatomy and fungal evolution and tracheal respiration. During the Carboniferous, the forests of the equatorial coal swamps removed from the atmosphere enough carbon dioxide to measurably change the composition of the Earth's atmosphere. They drove atmospheric oxygen to levels that had never been seen before and have never been seen since. They contributed to a global cooling event that produced one of the most significant ice ages in Earth's history. They created the soil that would sustain terrestrial ecosystems for the rest of geological time. They provided the habitat in which vertebrate life diversified and evolved the innovations, like the amniotic egg, that would eventually allow animals to conquer every corner of the land. And they laid down the energy reserves in the form of coal that would fuel a technological revolution hundreds of millions of years in the future. All of this was accomplished by organisms that had no brains, no awareness, no intention. They were plants driven by the simple imperatives of growth, reproduction, and competition for light and nutrients. They did not know that they were changing the world. They did not plan the transformation they wrought. They simply grew and died and grew again, and in doing so, they reshaped the planet. There is something humbling about this, something that forces us to reconsider our sense of what matters in the history of the Earth. We tend to focus on animals, on the dramatic, charismatic creatures that capture our imagination, the dinosaurs, the mammoths, the great predators. But the true architects of the world we live in are and have always been the plants. The quiet, patient-rooted organisms that convert sunlight into structure, that pull carbon from the air and lock it in their bodies, that oxygenate the atmosphere and build the soil. The Carboniferous period is their greatest triumph, their most spectacular performance, and its echoes reverberate through every aspect of our world today. Let us go deeper now into the geological mechanics of coal formation, because this process, which is central to the entire story of the Carboniferous, is more complex and more interesting than the simplified version that most people learn in school. The first stage of coal formation is the accumulation of peat. We have discussed this process at length. The plants grow, die, and fall into the waterlogged swamp, where decomposition is incomplete due to the lack of oxygen and the absence of effective lignin-degrading organisms. The dead plant material accumulates as a thick, waterlogged mass of partially decomposed organic matter. Peat is not coal. It is the raw material from which coal is made, but it requires further transformation to become the hard, black, energy-dense rock that we recognize as coal. That transformation is driven by two forces, burial and heat. As the peat accumulates, it is gradually buried by sediment. In the Carboniferous, the flat, low-lying swamplands were periodically flooded by the sea, and each flooding event deposited a layer of marine sediment, sand, silt, clay, and limestone on top of the peat. When the sea withdrew and the swamp re-established itself, a new layer of peat began to accumulate on top of the sediment. Over time, this process created a layer cake of alternating peat and sediment deposits, each layer pressing down on the ones below. The weight of the overlying sediment compresses the peat, squeezing out water and reducing its volume. As more and more sediment accumulates, the pressure increases and the peat is further compressed and compacted. At the same time, the heat from the Earth's interior increases with depth, and the buried peat is subjected to gradually rising temperatures. The combination of pressure and heat drives a series of chemical changes in the organic material. The process is called coalification, and it proceeds through several distinct stages. The first stage produces lignite, also known as brown coal. Lignite is the least mature form of coal. It is soft, crumbly, and still retains some of the original plant structure. It has a relatively low carbon content and a relatively high moisture content, and it produces less energy when burned than more mature forms of coal. Lignite forms at relatively shallow depths and moderate temperatures. The second stage produces subbituminous coal, which is denser and harder than lignite, with a higher carbon content and lower moisture content. Subbituminous coal forms at greater depths and higher temperatures than lignite. The third stage produces bituminous coal, which is the most common type of coal and the type most widely used for energy production. Bituminous coal is hard, dense, and black, with a high carbon content and a high energy density. It forms at significant depths and temperatures, and it represents a substantial transformation from the original peat. The fourth and final stage produces anthracite, the highest grade of coal. Anthracite is extremely hard, dense, and shiny, with the highest carbon content of any coal type, often exceeding 90%. It is the end product of coalification, the result of extreme pressure and temperature acting on organic material over hundreds of millions of years. Anthracite is relatively rare because it requires the most extreme conditions to form, but it is the most energy-dense form of coal and burns the cleanest. The coal deposits laid down during the Carboniferous have undergone varying degrees of coalification depending on their burial history. Some have remained as lignite or subbituminous coal, while others have been metamorphosed into high-grade bituminous coal or even anthracite. The specific grade of a coal deposit depends on how deeply it was buried, how much heat it was subjected to, and how long the coalification process continued. What is remarkable is that all of this, the entire process from living forest to geological coal seam, was set in motion by the simple act of plants growing and dying in a swamp 300 million years ago. The energy that is released when coal is burned is, literally, ancient sunlight that was captured by chloroplasts in the leaves of carboniferous plants and stored in the chemical bonds of organic molecules. When you burn coal, you are reversing the work of photosynthesis, breaking those bonds and releasing the energy that was captured when the light of a 300-million-year-old sun fell on the fronds of a tree fern in a tropical swamp. As the Carboniferous drew toward its close, the world was in a state of transition that would have seemed slow and imperceptible to any organism living through it, but was, from a geological perspective, dramatic and far-reaching. The coal swamps were retreating. Year by year, century by century, the area of lowland swamp forest was shrinking. In some regions, the swamps had already disappeared entirely, replaced by drier, more seasonal ecosystems dominated by seed-bearing plants. In other regions, the swamps hung on, reduced to isolated pockets in the most favorable locations, but no longer the continuous continent-spanning expanse they had been at their peak. The lycopsid trees were in decline. Their populations were shrinking as their habitat fragmented. In many areas, they had been replaced by tree ferns, which were somewhat more tolerant of seasonal conditions, or by early conifers and other gymnosperms, which were actively colonizing the newly available drier habitats. The atmosphere was changing. The oxygen levels, while still elevated, may have begun to decline as the rate of carbon burial slowed and the rate of decomposition increased, partly due to the evolution of more effective wood-decaying fungi. Carbon dioxide levels were still relatively low, but they too were beginning to change as the geological processes that had driven them down began to reverse. The great ice sheets of Gondwana were still present, still waxing and waning with the orbital cycles, still driving the sea level fluctuations that had created the cyclones. But the ice would not last forever. As the Permian dawned and the Carboniferous faded into geological memory, the ice sheets too would begin their long retreat, eventually disappearing entirely as the world warmed and dried in the transition to the late Permian. The animals of the Carboniferous were also changing. The great amphibians, still dominant in the waning swamps, were beginning to face competition from the increasingly diverse and numerous reptiles. The giant insects, those spectacular products of the high oxygen atmosphere, would persist for a while yet, but as oxygen levels declined in the Permian, the selective pressure that had allowed them to grow so large would ease, and their descendants would gradually return to more modest dimensions. The world was turning a page. The great Carboniferous experiment, the age when forests ruled the earth and remade the atmosphere, was coming to an end. But its consequences would endure, written in the rocks, encoded in the atmosphere, stored in the coal seams, and embedded in the evolutionary history of every living thing. Let us consider one more aspect of the Carboniferous world before we bring the first part of our story to a close: the role of the oceans. The oceans of the Carboniferous were vast and warm, at least in the equatorial regions. The shallow seas that bordered the equatorial continents were home to rich and diverse marine ecosystems. Coral reefs built by rugose and tabulate corals that looked quite different from the scleractinian corals that build modern reefs thrived in the warm, shallow waters. These reefs supported complex communities of organisms: brachiopods, crinoids, bryozoans, trilobites, though these ancient arthropods were in decline and would go extinct at the end of the Permian, mollusks, and a diverse assemblage of fish. The crinoids, or sea lilies, were particularly abundant during the Carboniferous. These are relatives of starfish and sea urchins, animals that attach to the seafloor by a long, flexible stalk and extend their feathery arms into the water to filter food particles from the current. In some Carboniferous marine environments, crinoids were so abundant that their broken stalks and arm segments, called columnals, form thick layers of limestone. Walk along a limestone outcrop from the Carboniferous, and you can often see these crinoid fragments embedded in the rock, little disc-shaped segments that look like tiny coins or stacked rings. The relationship between the marine and terrestrial ecosystems of the Carboniferous was intimate and complex. The rivers that drained the coal swamps carried vast quantities of dissolved organic matter, nutrients, and sediment into the shallow seas, fertilizing the marine ecosystems and influencing their productivity. The cyclical flooding of the coastal swamps by the sea created transitional environments where marine and freshwater organisms mixed. And the global changes in atmospheric composition driven by the terrestrial forests, the drawdown of carbon dioxide and the buildup of oxygen, had consequences for ocean chemistry, influencing ocean temperatures, circulation patterns, and the availability of dissolved gases. The Carboniferous oceans were also affected by the glaciation of Gondwana. The waxing and waning of the ice sheets drove fluctuations in sea level that repeatedly reorganized coastal marine environments, creating and destroying habitats, connecting and isolating populations, and driving evolutionary diversification. The cyclones that are so prominent in the terrestrial rock record have their equivalents in the marine record, where alternating layers of shallow water and deep water sediments record the same sea level fluctuations. As we pause here at the midpoint of our documentary, let us take stock of where we are in the story. We have explored the geography of the Carboniferous world, with its equatorial swamplands and its polar ice sheets. We have examined the extraordinary plants that dominated the coal swamps, the giant lycopsids with their rapid growth and their strange, columnar architecture. We have investigated the lignin problem, the absence of effective wood-decomposing fungi that allowed organic material to accumulate as peat rather than being recycled through decomposition. We have traced the consequences of this accumulation, the drawdown of atmospheric carbon dioxide, the rise of atmospheric oxygen, the cooling of the global climate, and the formation of the coal deposits that would one day fuel human civilization. We have met the giant insects, those spectacular products of the high oxygen atmosphere. We have observed the early tetrapods, both the amphibians that dominated the coal swamps and the small, unassuming reptiles that were quietly evolving the innovations that would make them the masters of the land. We have examined the soils that the forests created, the fires that the oxygen fueled, the cyclical flooding that the ice ages drove, and the marine ecosystems that bordered and interacted with the terrestrial world. And we have begun to see the signs of change, the slow, inexorable forces that were bringing the age of the coal swamps to an end. The assembly of Pangea, the rise of mountains, the drying of the climate, the fragmentation of the swamp habitats, the evolution of seed plants, and the emergence of effective lignin-decomposing fungi. The story is far from over. In the second part of our documentary, we will follow the decline of the coal swamps to its conclusion. We will explore the rise of the gymnosperms and the early reptiles in greater detail. We will examine the transition from the Carboniferous to the Permian and the dramatic changes that lay ahead for the planet. We will consider the lasting legacy of the Carboniferous forests, their imprint on the atmosphere, the biosphere, and the geological record. And we will reflect on the deepest lesson of the Carboniferous period, that the world we inhabit is built on foundations laid down hundreds of millions of years ago by organisms that no longer exist, that the energy we use, the air we breathe, the soil we cultivate, and the climate we experience are all, in profound and often invisible ways, products of that ancient, extraordinary age when forests ruled the earth and coal was born. The Carboniferous is not just a chapter in the history of the earth, it is the foundation of the world we live in. It is the hidden architecture beneath the surface of everything. And understanding it is essential to understanding who we are, where we came from, and what kind of planet we call home. Stay with us for the second part of this extraordinary journey into deep time. But before we leave the first half of our story, let us linger for just a few more moments in the Carboniferous world, because there are aspects of this ancient period that reward closer examination, details that deepen our understanding and sharpen our appreciation of just how remarkable this era truly was. Consider, for example, the question of color. When we imagine the Carboniferous forests, we tend to picture them in shades of green, because that is the color we associate with plants and photosynthesis. And certainly green was the dominant color of the coal swamp, but the Carboniferous world was not monochromatic. The bark of the lycopsid trees may have been brown or gray or even reddish, depending on the species. The spore-bearing cones of the lycopsids, which grew at the tops of the trunks, may have been brightly colored to attract the wind or to signal their reproductive readiness. The peat beneath the trees was dark brown or black, stained by tannins and humic acids. The water was amber or brown, like strong tea. The insects may have had brightly colored wings or bodies, though fossilization rarely preserves color, so we can only speculate. And the sky. The sky of the Carboniferous would have looked different from the sky of today. The denser atmosphere, with its higher oxygen content, might have scattered light differently, producing subtly different hues at sunrise and sunset. The persistent humidity of the equatorial regions would have filled the air with haze and mist, softening the light and blurring the horizon. On clear days, if clear days ever came to the coal swamps, the sky might have been a deeper, more intense blue than we are accustomed to, a consequence of the denser atmosphere scattering more of the shorter wavelengths of sunlight. Consider also the sounds. We tend to think of ancient landscapes as silent because we have no way of directly hearing the past, but the Carboniferous coal swamp was almost certainly a noisy place. The buzz and drone of insect wings would have been a constant background sound, rising and falling in intensity as different species became active at different times of day. The wind moving through the canopy would have produced its own characteristic sound, different from the sound of wind in a modern forest because the leaves were different, the branch structures were different, the trunk densities were different. The splash of amphibians entering the water, the rustle of cockroaches in the leaf litter, the creak of lycopsid trunks swaying in the breeze, all of these would have contributed to a rich, complex soundscape that we can only imagine. And the smells. Swamps have distinctive smells, and the Carboniferous coal swamp would have been no exception. The decomposing peat would have produced a rich, organic, slightly sulfurous odor. The standing water would have smelled of tannins and decaying vegetation. The living plants may have released volatile organic compounds, the same kinds of chemicals that give modern forests their characteristic scent. Whether the Carboniferous forest smelled like a modern pine forest or a modern cypress swamp or something entirely different, we cannot know. But we can be sure that it had a smell, a rich, complex, overwhelming smell that would have hit you like a wall the moment you stepped through our imaginary time portal. There is one more topic that deserves our attention before we conclude this first part, the question of how we know what we know about the Carboniferous. Our knowledge of the Carboniferous period comes from multiple sources, each providing a different window into the past. The most important source is the fossil record, the preserved remains and traces of ancient organisms found in rocks around the world. Carboniferous fossils include the petrified trunks and leaves of ancient plants, the compressed imprints of fern fronds in shale, the mineralized bones of vertebrate animals, the exquisitely preserved wings of giant insects in fine-grained sediments, and the trackways and burrows of organisms that walked and crawled across the ancient landscape. Some Carboniferous fossils are truly extraordinary. In certain localities, entire sections of coal swamp forest have been preserved in 3 dimensions, frozen in time by volcanic ash falls or rapid burial in sediment. These fossil forests, sometimes called coal balls when the 3-dimensional preservation occurs within the coal itself, provide an unparalleled view of the structure and composition of the ancient ecosystem. Researchers can study the internal anatomy of the plants, examining their cells and tissues under the microscope, identifying the species present, estimating the density and diversity of the forest, and even determining the season in which the plants were buried. Coal balls are formed when mineralized fluids, typically rich in calcium carbonate, permeate the peat before it is compressed into coal. The minerals fill the cells and spaces of the plant tissue, replacing the organic material with stone while preserving the original cellular structure in exquisite detail. When a coal ball is cut open and polished, the internal anatomy of the ancient plants is revealed with a clarity that is almost miraculous. Individual cells, growth rings, reproductive structures, fungal hyphae, insect borings, all preserved in 3-dimensional, microscopic detail. In addition to fossils, our knowledge of the Carboniferous comes from the study of the rocks themselves. The mineralogy, chemistry, and sedimentary structures of Carboniferous rocks tell us about the environments in which they were deposited, whether the water was fresh or salt, shallow or deep, calm or turbulent. The chemistry of ancient soils tells us about the atmosphere and climate of the time. The arrangement of rock layers tells us about the history of sea level changes and tectonic movements. Geochemistry provides another window. By analyzing the isotopic composition of carbon and oxygen in Carboniferous rocks and fossils, scientists can estimate the concentrations of carbon dioxide and oxygen in the ancient atmosphere. These isotopic analyses have been critical in establishing the picture of the Carboniferous atmosphere that we have described, with its elevated oxygen and reduced carbon dioxide, and molecular biology provides yet another perspective. By studying the genomes of living organisms and estimating the rates at which genetic changes accumulate over time, scientists can construct molecular clocks that estimate when specific evolutionary innovations occurred. It was this kind of molecular clock analysis that led to the hypothesis that white rot fungi evolved their lignin-degrading enzymes near the end of the Carboniferous, a hypothesis that has profound implications for our understanding of why coal formation was so abundant during this period and why it declined afterward. All of these lines of evidence, fossils, rocks, geochemistry, molecular biology, converge to give us a picture of the Carboniferous that is remarkably detailed and internally consistent. It is not a complete picture, of course. There are gaps and uncertainties, questions that remain unanswered, debates that are still ongoing. But the broad outlines of the story are clear, and they tell us something extraordinary about the history of our planet and the deep, ancient roots of the world we live in today. We have reached the end of the first part of our journey into the Carboniferous. We have traveled 350 million years into the past, to a world that was in many ways unrecognizable, a world of giant insects, towering lycopsid forests, waterlogged swamps, and an atmosphere richer in oxygen and poorer in carbon dioxide than anything we have experienced in recorded human history. We have explored the mechanisms that drove this world, the interplay of geology, climate, evolution, and atmospheric chemistry that made the Carboniferous one of the most distinctive and consequential periods in the history of the Earth. And we have begun to see the cracks in the system, the slow, subtle changes that were undermining the foundations of the coal swamp world and setting the stage for a different kind of planet, one dominated not by spore-bearing swamp trees but by seed-bearing land plants, not by giant amphibians but by the versatile egg-laying reptiles that would eventually inherit the Earth. In the second part of our documentary, we will follow these threads to their conclusions. We will watch the coal swamps disappear and the gymnosperms rise. We will see the amphibians yield to the reptiles. We will explore the aftermath of the Carboniferous, the legacy it left in the rocks, in the atmosphere, and in the evolutionary history of life. And we will reflect on the meaning of it all, on what the Carboniferous tells us about our planet, our history, and ourselves. The story continues. The forests are falling, but their legacy is forever. Welcome back to our journey through deep time, through the extraordinary age when forests ruled the Earth and the planet itself was remade by the quiet, relentless work of ancient trees. In the first part of our documentary, we explored the rise of the Carboniferous coal swamps, the magnificent lycopsid forests that dominated the equatorial lowlands, the strange and consequential absence of lignin-decomposing fungi, the oxygen-rich atmosphere that gave birth to giant insects, and the first signs of the slow transformation that would eventually bring this remarkable world to an end. Now in this second part, we will follow that transformation to its conclusion, and we will reckon with the full weight of what the Carboniferous period means, not just as a chapter in geological history, but as the hidden foundation of the world we live in today. Let us begin where we left off, in the late Carboniferous, in a world that is changing. The coal swamps did not die all at once. They did not collapse in a single catastrophic event, the way a building might collapse when its foundation gives way. Instead, they diminished gradually, retreating like a tide going out, pulling back from the edges of the landscape and concentrating in the most favorable locations, in the deepest, wettest, most sheltered basins, while the surrounding terrain dried and changed around them. This process, which geologists sometimes call the Carboniferous rainforest collapse, was driven primarily by the ongoing assembly of the supercontinent Pangaea. The collision of the northern and southern landmasses was building a mountain range of extraordinary dimensions, a range that stretched across the heart of the forming supercontinent like a spine. These mountains, which geologists call the Variscan or Hercynian Mountains in the European part of their extent, and the Alleghenian Mountains in what would become the eastern edge of the North American continent, were not small hills. At their peak, they may have rivaled the modern Himalayas in height, towering peaks of bare rock rising above the snowline, their summits perpetually cold and windy. Mountains of this size profoundly alter the climate of the surrounding regions. They create rain shadows, blocking the flow of moisture-laden air and causing the areas downwind to become significantly drier. They enhance the seasonality of the climate, creating more pronounced differences between wet and dry seasons as they deflect and disrupt atmospheric circulation patterns. They changed the flow of rivers, altering the drainage patterns of entire continents and redirecting the water that would otherwise feed the coastal swamps. As the Variscan Mountains rose during the late Carboniferous, the climate of the equatorial regions became increasingly seasonal. The perpetual tropical wet season that had sustained the coal swamps for millions of years gave way to a pattern of alternating wet and dry periods. The dry seasons were at first brief and mild, but they grew longer and more intense as the mountains rose higher and the climate shifted further from its earlier, more uniform state. For the lycopsid trees, even a brief dry season could be damaging. Their shallow, horizontal root systems were adapted to drawing water from saturated, waterlogged soil. When the water table dropped, even temporarily, the lycopsids suffered. Their rapid growth, so advantageous in the continuously wet environment of the deep swamp, became a liability when water was scarce, because fast-growing plants typically have high water requirements that cannot be met during periods of drought. The seedling stage was particularly vulnerable. Lycopsid seedlings needed wet, soft, peat-rich surfaces to establish themselves. During dry seasons, the exposed peat surfaces dried and hardened, becoming inhospitable to germination. Lycopsid regeneration slowed, then failed in some areas. When adult trees died, as they inevitably did after their brief decades of life, there were no seedlings ready to take their place. Gaps appeared in the forest canopy, and into those gaps other plants moved. The plants that moved into the gaps left by the declining lycopsids were of several kinds, and they represent different strategies for coping with the increasingly variable Carboniferous climate. Tree ferns were among the most immediate colonizers of disturbed or opened areas. Tree ferns, despite being spore-bearing plants with a reproductive cycle still dependent on water, were somewhat more tolerant of temporary drought than the lycopsids. Their fronds could tolerate brief dry periods without permanent damage, and their spores could remain dormant in the soil through short dry seasons, germinating when moisture returned. In areas where the dry seasons were brief and mild, tree ferns expanded their range, filling the canopy gaps left by the dying lycopsids and creating a different kind of forest, lower, less dense, and botanically more diverse than the lycopsid-dominated swamp of the earlier Carboniferous. But the more significant colonizers, the plants that truly represented the future, were the gymnosperms. Throughout the Carboniferous, while the lycopsid forests had dominated the lowland swamps, the gymnosperms had been quietly diversifying in the drier upland habitats at the margins of the swamp basins. These were not the conifers of modern forests, though conifers were among the gymnosperm groups that had evolved by the late Carboniferous. They included also a diverse array of other seed-bearing plants. The cordatelians, tall, slender trees with long, strap-like leaves that may have resembled modern Araucaria pines in some respects. The seed ferns, plants that looked superficially like ferns but reproduced by means of seeds rather than spores, and various other groups whose relationships to modern plants are sometimes unclear. The gymnosperms had been waiting at the margins for their opportunity, and as the climate changed and the lycopsid forests retreated, that opportunity arrived. They moved down from the uplands into the lowlands, colonizing the drying margins of the swamp basins, establishing themselves in habitats that the lycopsids could no longer maintain. They were versatile where the lycopsids were specialized. They were drought-tolerant where the lycopsids were drought-sensitive. They could reproduce in seasonally dry environments where the lycopsids could not, and they were, in an evolutionary sense, the future. The transition was not immediate and it was not uniform. In different regions, the shift from lycopsid dominance to gymnosperm dominance happened at different rates and with different intermediate stages. In some areas, the transition was drawn out over millions of years, with periods of lycopsid recovery followed by renewed decline. In other areas, it was more abrupt, triggered by a particularly severe dry season or a major sea level change that disrupted the local swamp ecosystem beyond recovery. But the overall direction was clear. Across the breadth of the equatorial regions, across the fragmented and shrinking coal swamp landscape, the age of the lycopsids was ending and the age of the gymnosperms was beginning. The torch of forest dominance was being passed from the ancient, specialized swamp trees to the versatile, adaptable seed plants, and this handoff would shape the character of terrestrial ecosystems for the next 250 million years. While the plants were undergoing their dramatic reorganization, the animals of the Carboniferous world were also changing. Let us look more closely at the vertebrate animals, because their story during the late Carboniferous and the transition into the Permian is one of the most important in the entire history of life on land. We left the early reptiles in a humble position, small, lizard-like animals sheltering in hollow tree stumps, representing a promising evolutionary novelty but not yet a dominant force in the ecosystem. By the end of the Carboniferous, this was beginning to change. The reptile lineage was diversifying, and some members of this lineage were beginning to move into ecological roles that had previously been occupied by amphibians. The key to the reptile's growing success was, as we discussed in the first part, the amniotic egg, but the amniotic egg was only one part of the story. Along with their waterproof eggs, the early reptiles had also evolved other adaptations for life on land that made them better suited to the increasingly dry, seasonal world of the late Carboniferous. Their skin was more resistant to water loss than the moist, permeable skin of amphibians. Their lungs were more efficient. Their legs were positioned more directly beneath their bodies, giving them a more upright posture that was more energy efficient for terrestrial locomotion than the sprawling gait of most amphibians. These adaptations combined to make the early reptiles capable of exploiting habitats that were off-limits to amphibians. The dry uplands, the seasonal environments, the interior regions of continents that were too far from permanent water for amphibians to survive. As the coal swamps fragmented and the world became more seasonally dry, these dry habitats became more extensive, and the reptiles were positioned to exploit them. Among the most important early reptile lineages of the late Carboniferous and early Permian was a group called the synapsids. The synapsids are the lineage that would eventually give rise to mammals, and their earliest representatives appeared during the late Carboniferous. These early synapsids, sometimes called pelycosaurs in older literature, were not mammals, and they were not particularly mammal-like in their appearance. They ranged in size from small, lizard-like insectivores to large predators and herbivores that could reach 10 feet or more in length. Some synapsids of the early Permian are famous for a spectacular anatomical feature, the sail. Animals like Dimetrodon, often mistakenly called dinosaurs in popular culture, but actually more closely related to mammals than to any reptile, had elaborate sails on their backs, formed by enormously elongated neural spines rising from the vertebrae and connected by a thin membrane of skin. The function of these sails has been debated for decades. The most popular hypothesis is thermoregulation. By orienting the sail toward the sun, a cold-blooded Dimetrodon could absorb heat and warm its body more quickly in the cool morning, giving it an advantage over prey species that were still sluggish with cold. But alternative hypotheses involving species recognition, sexual selection, or fat storage have also been proposed. Whatever the function of the sail, Dimetrodon and its relatives represent the growing dominance of the synapsid lineage in the terrestrial ecosystems of the late Carboniferous and early Permian. They were becoming larger, more diverse, and more ecologically dominant, gradually displacing the amphibians from many of the roles they had occupied in the earlier Carboniferous ecosystem. The giant insects of the Carboniferous deserve a second look as we consider the broader trajectory of the period, because their story is intimately connected to the story of the atmosphere, and their fate tells us something important about the direction the world was taking. We have established that the gigantism of Carboniferous arthropods was enabled by the elevated oxygen levels of the Carboniferous atmosphere, which allowed the inefficient tracheal respiratory system of insects to function at larger body sizes than would be possible in the modern atmosphere. As long as oxygen levels remained high, the giant insects flourished. The dragonflies cruised through the coal swamp canopy on their 2.5-foot wings. Arthropleura pushed through the leaf litter on its 6 feet of segmented body. Giant cockroaches scuttled through the undergrowth, but during the late Carboniferous and into the Permian, oxygen levels were beginning to change. The rate of organic carbon burial was slowing as the coal swamps shrank and as the white rot fungi became more effective at decomposing wood. As less carbon was being removed from the atmosphere and locked away in peat, more of the carbon dioxide produced by respiration and decomposition remained in the air. And as more carbon dioxide returned to the atmosphere, the drawdown of oxygen slowed and then reversed. The decline in oxygen levels was gradual, playing out over millions of years, but its effects on the giant arthropods were real. As oxygen dropped back toward and eventually below modern levels during the Permian, the respiratory ceiling for insect body size dropped with it. The selective pressure that had allowed giant insects to exist relaxed and then reversed, favoring smaller body sizes that could be adequately supplied with oxygen through the tracheal system. The giant insects did not go extinct all at once. They persisted for a while into the Permian, but their diversity and abundance declined. New groups of insects were evolving, many of them with more efficient respiratory systems or with behavioral adaptations, like pumping movements that actively ventilated the tracheal tubes. that partly compensated for the lower oxygen levels. And there was another factor working against the giant arthropods, the rise of vertebrate predators. As the reptiles diversified and grew larger during the late Carboniferous and Permian, they became increasingly effective predators of large insects. A meganeura with a 2.5-foot wingspan is an impressive creature, but it is not invulnerable. A fast, agile small reptile with good eyesight and sharp teeth could make a meal of it. As vertebrate predators became more diverse and more effective, the giant insects faced increasing predation pressure, adding another force to the declining oxygen levels that was pushing their maximum body sizes down. The age of the giant insects was ending, as quietly and gradually as it had begun. The meganeura would not fly through any forest of the modern world. Arthropleura would not push through any modern leaf litter. These creatures were products of a very specific set of atmospheric and ecological conditions that prevailed for a specific bounded period of geological time. When those conditions changed, the creatures they had supported changed too. This is one of the deepest lessons of the Carboniferous, that life is not independent of its physical environment. It is shaped by it, constrained by it, enabled by it. The giant insects were not larger than modern insects because they were somehow more vigorous or more ambitious. They were larger because the atmosphere allowed it. When the atmosphere changed, they shrank. Life and the physical world are not separate things. They are one system, endlessly interacting, endlessly co-evolving, endlessly reshaping each other. Let us turn our attention now to a phenomenon that is particularly striking in the rock record of the late Carboniferous, the evidence for the rhythmic alternation of wet and dry climates, driven by the glacial cycles of the Gondwanan ice sheets. We discussed cyclones in the first part of our documentary, the repeating sequences of rock layers that record cycles of sea level rise and fall. But let us now look more closely at what these cycles meant for the organisms that lived through them, and what they tell us about the nature of the late Carboniferous world. Imagine living in the coal swamp during one of these glacial cycles. The cycle begins during a period of glacial expansion, when ice sheets are growing on Gondwana and global sea levels are dropping. As sea levels fall, the shallow seas that have been periodically flooding the coastal swamps withdraw. New land is exposed. The swamps expand outward, colonizing the newly available terrain. The lycopsid forest spread, peat accumulates, and the ecosystem is at its most productive. Then the orbital cycles shift. The amount of solar energy reaching the southern hemisphere increases slightly, and the Gondwanan ice sheets begin to melt. Meltwater pours into the ocean, and sea levels begin to rise. The rise is not instantaneous, but it is relatively rapid by geological standards, perhaps several meters over thousands of years. As the sea rises, the coastal swamps are flooded. Saltwater invades the freshwater ecosystem. The lycopsid trees, which cannot tolerate saltwater, are killed. The standing forest is drowned, its trunks falling into the encroaching marine waters, its root systems inundated by the sea. Over the flooded surface of the drowned swamp, marine sediment accumulates. Shell fragments, limestone, mud, silty clay, these materials rain down from the shallow seawater above, burying the drowned peat, sealing it beneath a layer of marine rock. And then the cycle reverses again. The ice sheets begin to grow once more, sea levels fall. The sea withdraws, the marine sediment is exposed, and colonization by terrestrial organisms begins again. Pioneer plants, the first organisms to return to the newly exposed surface, are typically small, fast-growing, opportunistic species. Gradually, over hundreds or thousands of years, the vegetation thickens, the peat begins to accumulate, and the swamp forest re-establishes itself. This cycle from swamp to sea to swamp repeated itself dozens of times during the late Carboniferous, creating the stacked sequences of coal seams and marine sediments that are the defining stratigraphic signature of the Carboniferous coal measures. Each coal seam in such a sequence represents one period of swamp forest development. Each marine limestone or shale layer represents one period of marine flooding. The alternating layers are a geological record of the Earth's heartbeat, the slow, rhythmic pulse of glacial advance and retreat that controlled so much of the Carboniferous world. What is remarkable is the resilience that the coal swamp ecosystem showed during these cycles. Despite being repeatedly drowned and destroyed, it kept coming back. The lycopsid trees were adapted to disturbance. They could recolonize a newly exposed surface quickly, growing rapidly and establishing a new forest within a few thousand years. And the seeds and spores of the other swamp plants remained viable in the sediment, ready to germinate when conditions permitted. But this resilience had its limits. As the overall climate trended drier and more seasonal, each cycle of recovery was a little less complete. Each re-established swamp was a little smaller, a little less diverse, a little more fragmented. The cumulative effect of many cycles of disruption and imperfect recovery, combined with the long-term drying trend driven by tectonics, was a progressive diminishment of the coal swamp ecosystem that ultimately proved irreversible. The late Carboniferous also saw significant evolutionary developments in the plant kingdom beyond the obvious lycopsid gymnosperm transition. Among the most interesting of these developments was the diversification of the seed ferns, a group of plants that occupied an important ecological position during this period and whose evolutionary relationships have long been a subject of scientific interest and debate. Seed ferns, or pteridosperms, were plants that looked like ferns, with large, compound fronds that were superficially similar to the fronds of modern tree ferns. But unlike true ferns, seed ferns reproduced by seeds rather than spores. They were seed plants, but they had not yet evolved the compact, efficient seed cones of the later gymnosperms. Instead, their seeds were relatively large and naked, attached directly to the fronds or to specialized branch systems, exposed to the environment in a way that the seeds of more advanced gymnosperms were not. Seed ferns were ecologically diverse during the Carboniferous and early Permian. Some were small, scrambling plants that grew at the edges of the coal swamps or in the undergrowth of the gymnosperm forests. Others were larger, with trunks several feet tall and fronds that spread several feet in each direction. Some had lianas, vine-like climbing stems that used the trunks of other trees for support, a growth strategy that would eventually become extremely common in the tropical forests of the Cretaceous and Cenozoic. The seed ferns are important not just for their own sake, but for what they tell us about the diversity of plant life in the late Carboniferous. The Carboniferous was not a world of simple, monotonous vegetation. Alongside the dominant lycopsids and the rising gymnosperms, there were tree ferns, calamites, seed ferns, and a host of smaller, less conspicuous plants that together created a complex, multi-layered ecological community. The coal swamp was not a monoculture. It was a rich, diverse ecosystem, even if it was dominated by a particular group of plants. This diversity was part of what made the Carboniferous ecosystem so resilient in the face of repeated disturbance. When the lycopsids were damaged or killed by flooding or drought, other plants were ready to fill the gaps. The tree ferns, the seed ferns, the calamites, all of these could serve as ecological substitutes, maintaining some level of forest cover and ecosystem function even when the dominant lycopsids were absent. This diversity was a buffer against total collapse, a safety net that kept the ecosystem functioning through the repeated cycles of disturbance that characterized the late Carboniferous. Now let us consider something that we have touched on but not fully explored, the role of the Carboniferous in the broader context of Earth's long-term carbon cycle. The Earth's carbon cycle operates on multiple timescales. On short timescales, measured in years or decades, carbon cycles through the atmosphere, oceans, and living organisms in a relatively rapid dynamic exchange. Photosynthesis removes carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and incorporates it into organic matter. Respiration and decomposition release that carbon back to the atmosphere. The ocean absorbs carbon dioxide from the air and releases it back through a complex set of physical and chemical processes. These short-term cycles maintain the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere within a relatively narrow range, at least when the system is not perturbed by external forces. But there is also a long-term carbon cycle, operating on timescales of millions to hundreds of millions of years, that involves the movement of carbon between the atmosphere, the biosphere, the oceans, and the solid Earth, including the rocks of the continental crust and the mantle. This long-term cycle is driven by geological processes, the weathering of rocks, the deposition of sediments, the subduction of oceanic crust, and volcanic outgassing. The Carboniferous sits at a critical juncture in this long-term cycle. The mass burial of organic carbon in the coal swamps was not just a local or regional phenomenon. It was a global-scale perturbation of the carbon cycle that had consequences for the entire Earth system. By removing vast quantities of carbon from the atmosphere and locking them away in the solid rock of coal seams, the Carboniferous forests drove atmospheric carbon dioxide to some of its lowest levels in the entire Phanerozoic Eon, the last 540 million years of Earth history. The consequences of this carbon drawdown were far-reaching. We have already discussed the cooling of the global climate and the glaciation of Gondwana, but there were other consequences as well. Low carbon dioxide levels affect the efficiency of photosynthesis. Carbon dioxide is the raw material that plants use to build their tissues, and at very low concentrations, photosynthesis becomes less efficient. Some researchers have suggested that the very low carbon dioxide levels of the late Carboniferous may have created a negative feedback on the coal swamp forests themselves, limiting their productivity and potentially contributing to their decline. It is a fascinating possibility, a world in which the forest's own success in removing carbon from the atmosphere eventually undermined the conditions that allowed them to thrive. Low carbon dioxide levels also affect the competitiveness of different plant types. In the modern world, plants can be broadly divided into those that use a photosynthetic pathway called C3 and those that use a pathway called C4. C4 plants are more efficient at capturing carbon dioxide at low atmospheric concentrations, and they tend to be more competitive in warm, dry conditions. During the Carboniferous, with its very low carbon dioxide levels, the selective pressure on plants to evolve more efficient carbon-capturing mechanisms may have been significant. The gymnosperms of the Carboniferous and Permian may have had advantages over the lycopsids precisely because of their ability to function more efficiently under the low carbon dioxide conditions that the lycopsids' own success had created. This is one of the beautiful ironies of the Carboniferous story. The success of the coal swamp forests in drawing down atmospheric carbon dioxide may have been one of the forces that drove their own eventual replacement by seed-bearing plants better suited to the low carbon dioxide world the forests had created. Let us now consider the fate of the Carboniferous world as it transitioned into the Permian, and the dramatic changes that awaited the Earth in the period that followed. The end of the Carboniferous, roughly 299 million years ago, is defined geologically by changes in the fossil record, particularly in the populations of certain marine invertebrates that changed significantly at this time. But for the terrestrial ecosystems that are the focus of our story, the transition from Carboniferous to Permian was not a sharp boundary. It was a continuation of trends that had been underway for millions of years. The early Permian world was significantly different from the early Carboniferous world. The great coal swamps of the equatorial regions had largely vanished, replaced by drier, more seasonal landscapes dominated by gymnosperms. The Gondwanan ice sheets, though still present in the earliest Permian, were beginning their long retreat as the climate warmed. The synapsids were diversifying rapidly, evolving larger body sizes and a greater variety of ecological roles, and were becoming the dominant large terrestrial vertebrates. The amphibians were retreating to increasingly marginal roles as they would continue to do throughout the Mesozoic, until they were left with only the relatively modest diversity of frogs, salamanders, and caecilians that we see today. The Permian world was, in many ways, the direct precursor of the world we know. The gymnosperms that dominated its landscapes were the ancestors of the conifers, cycads, and ginkgos of the modern world. The synapsids that were diversifying across its continents were the ancestors of the mammals. The diapsid reptiles, the other major lineage of amniotes that was diversifying alongside the synapsids, would eventually give rise to the crocodilians, lizards, snakes, turtles, and through the archosaurs to the dinosaurs and eventually the birds. The Permian was building toward the modern world, but it was also building toward something else, something terrible, something that would come at the very end of the period and would be the most severe biological crisis in the history of complex life. The end of the Permian, roughly 252 million years ago, saw the greatest mass extinction in Earth's history. This event, sometimes called the Great Dying, is estimated to have wiped out more than 90% of all marine species and roughly 70% of all terrestrial vertebrate species. It dwarfs the more famous mass extinction at the end of the Cretaceous that killed the non-avian dinosaurs. It was, by any measure, the closest that complex life on Earth has ever come to complete elimination. The causes of the end Permian mass extinction are complex and still debated, but the primary driver is generally agreed to be an episode of massive volcanic activity in what is now Siberia. The Siberian Traps, a large igneous province that represents one of the most extensive volcanic events in Earth's history. The eruption of the Siberian Traps over a period of perhaps 1 to 2 million years released enormous quantities of carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, and other gases into the atmosphere, driving a rapid and severe greenhouse warming event, acidifying the oceans, and disrupting the global climate in ways that most ecosystems could not survive. The end Permian extinction is not directly part of the Carboniferous story, but it is relevant to our narrative for one important reason. It represents the destruction of much of what the Carboniferous had built. The diverse marine ecosystems that had evolved in the warm, productive Permian seas were devastated. The synapsids, which had been flourishing and diversifying throughout the Permian, were reduced to a handful of surviving lineages. The gymnosperm forests of the continents were disrupted and replaced, temporarily, by low-diversity disaster floras. The world that the Carboniferous had set in motion, the world of diverse terrestrial vertebrates and seed-bearing forests, was brought to the brink of annihilation. That the world recovered at all, that life came back and eventually reached the extraordinary diversity of the modern world, is a testament to the resilience of biological systems. But the world that emerged from the end Permian extinction was not the same as the one that had entered it. New groups rose to dominance. The diapsid reptiles, which had survived the extinction in greater numbers and diversity than the synapsids, radiated explosively in the Triassic period that followed, eventually giving rise to the dinosaurs that would dominate terrestrial ecosystems for the next 150 million years. The synapsid survivors, reduced to small, burrowing insectivorous forms, persisted in marginal roles throughout the Mesozoic before diversifying again into the mammals that dominate today. But all of this, the entire story of the Mesozoic and the Cenozoic and the world we inhabit now, is built on the foundation laid by the Carboniferous. The coal that the Carboniferous forests produced, the soil they created, the atmospheric oxygen they generated, the evolutionary innovations they catalyzed, all of these are threads that run continuously from the Carboniferous to the present, connecting the ancient past to the living world. Let us now turn to what is perhaps the most profound and resonant aspect of the entire Carboniferous story, the connection between those ancient forests and the modern world, the way in which the compressed sunlight of Carboniferous plants became the fuel that powered an industrial civilization. Coal has been used by human beings for thousands of years. Ancient peoples in various parts of the world discovered that certain black rocks would burn and used them for heating and cooking. But the large-scale exploitation of coal as an industrial fuel began in earnest during the 18th and 19th centuries, as the development of the steam engine created an insatiable demand for energy that wood and other traditional fuels could not supply. The steam engine runs on heat, and heat requires fuel. Coal is an extraordinarily energy-dense fuel, capable of generating far more heat per unit mass than wood or peat. And coal was available in enormous quantities, accessible to mining in thick seams that ran through the rocks of many continental regions. As the Industrial Revolution expanded, coal mines multiplied and deepened. Shaft mines extended hundreds of feet below the surface, following the coal seams wherever they led. Networks of railways and canals were built to transport the coal from the mines to the factories and cities that consumed it. Coal became the foundation of industrial civilization, the energy source that powered the forges and furnaces and steam engines that transformed the material conditions of human life. Every ton of coal burned in those industrial furnaces had a history stretching back 300 million years. Every flame that leaped from a coal fire was releasing energy that had been captured by chloroplasts in the leaves of lycopsid trees in a carboniferous swamp. The workers who mined the coal, the engineers who designed the engines that burned it, the factory owners who built their industries on it, none of them knew or needed to know this ancient history. But it was there, embedded in every lump of black rock, a record of a world so remote in time as to be almost incomprehensible. The Industrial Revolution that coal made possible transformed human society in ways that are still unfolding. It drove urbanization as people moved from the countryside to the cities in search of factory work. It enabled mass production, replacing artisanal manufacturing with mechanized production on a previously unimaginable scale. It connected distant regions through railways and steam-powered ships, knitting together a global economy. It generated the wealth that funded scientific research, education, and infrastructure. And it produced consequences, atmospheric, social, ecological, that continue to shape our world in the 21st century. When we burn coal, we are not just releasing heat and light. We are releasing carbon dioxide that was removed from the atmosphere 300 million years ago. We are reversing, in centuries, a process of carbon sequestration that took tens of millions of years to accomplish. We are in a very literal sense undoing the work of the Carboniferous forests, returning to the atmosphere the carbon that those ancient trees removed and locked away. The Carboniferous period and the modern world are connected by a thread of carbon, pulled from the ancient air by long-dead plants, buried in the ground, compressed into coal, extracted from the earth, and burned in furnaces and engines. The ancient and the modern are not separate. They are one continuous story, told in the language of carbon and energy and atmospheric chemistry. But let us step back from the very large scale for a moment and consider some of the smaller, more intimate details of the Carboniferous world that we have not yet fully explored. Because the greatness of a historical period is often found not just in its grand themes but in its particulars, in the specific organisms and specific places and specific moments that bring the abstract patterns to life. Consider, for example, the question of what happened at night in the Carboniferous coal swamp. We tend to think about ancient ecosystems primarily in terms of the daytime, when the plants are photosynthesizing and the large, visible animals are active. But nighttime was as much a part of the Carboniferous world as daytime, and it had its own ecology. Many insects are nocturnal, and this was likely as true in the Carboniferous as it is today. As the sun set over the coal swamp, the forest would have entered a different phase of activity. Nocturnal insects would have emerged from their daytime hiding places in the bark and leaf litter, beginning their nighttime foraging and mating activities. Cockroaches, which are predominantly nocturnal today, would have been particularly active, scuttling through the dark forest floor in large numbers, feeding on dead plant material and other organic debris. What about the vertebrate animals? The amphibians that dominated the Carboniferous waterways were probably active both day and night, as many modern amphibians are. The early reptiles, however, being ectothermic, dependent on external heat sources to maintain their body temperature, would have been more constrained by temperature. At night, when temperatures dropped, the small lizard-like reptiles of the Carboniferous would have become sluggish and inactive, sheltering in crevices and under bark to conserve heat. The night sky over the Carboniferous coal swamp would have been spectacular, entirely dark, without any trace of artificial light, the stars blazing in their full number and intensity. The Milky Way would have been a prominent feature of the nighttime sky, a broad, bright band of light arching across the darkness. The moon would have been slightly closer to the Earth than it is today, appearing slightly larger in the sky, its light casting soft shadows among the lycopsid trunks. And perhaps the most haunting detail of all, the absence of certain sounds that we take for granted. There were no birds in the Carboniferous. The haunting calls and melodious songs that we associate with nighttime in a modern forest, the hoots of owls, the calls of nightjars, the chirping of frogs, though wait, the ancestors of frogs were present, the calls of early amphibians might well have filled the night air. The specific acoustic landscape of the Carboniferous night is lost to us, but it was real, and it was complex, and it was part of the rich, full reality of that ancient world. The Carboniferous also raises profound questions about the nature of ecological stability and change. The coal swamp ecosystem persisted for tens of millions of years, across multiple glacial cycles, across the slow drift of continents, across the evolution of new organisms and the extinction of others. This is an extraordinary demonstration of ecological resilience, but what maintained this resilience, what kept the coal swamp ecosystem functioning for so long in the face of repeated disturbances, part of the answer lies in the physical setting. The flat, low-lying terrain of the equatorial regions was inherently stable in some respects, changing only very slowly in response to tectonic forces. The warm, humid climate of the equatorial zone was maintained by the position of the landmasses relative to the sun, and this position changed only very slowly. The basic physical template of warm, wet, flat, low-lying equatorial terrain persisted for long enough to allow the coal swamp ecosystem to become deeply established. Part of the answer also lies in the biological structure of the ecosystem itself. The coal swamps were not simple, fragile communities. They were complex, multi-layered systems with many species occupying different ecological roles. This biological diversity provided redundancy, multiple species capable of performing similar ecological functions. When one species declined or was lost, others could expand to fill its role. This redundancy buffered the ecosystem against the loss of any single component. But perhaps most importantly, the resilience of the coal swamp ecosystem was sustained by the feedback loops between the living community and its physical environment. The forests maintained the moist, humid conditions that they needed to survive by releasing large quantities of water vapor through transpiration, by shading the soil surface and preventing it from drying out, and by their root systems holding the waterlogged peat in place. As long as the forest was intact, it perpetuated the conditions that allowed it to exist. This kind of ecosystem-level feedback, where the living community actively maintains the physical conditions of its own habitat, is now recognized as a fundamental feature of many ecological systems. Tropical rainforests generate a significant portion of their own rainfall through transpiration. Peat bogs maintain their own waterlogged conditions by accumulating organic material that holds water like a sponge. Coral reefs build the physical structures that provide habitat for the diverse communities they support. The coal swamps of the Carboniferous were an early and particularly dramatic example of this kind of self-maintaining, self-perpetuating ecological system, and like all such systems, they were resilient up to a point. When the external forces driving change, the tectonic rearrangement of continents, the alteration of climate patterns exceeded the capacity of the ecosystem to compensate, the feedback loops broke down, the self-maintaining conditions could no longer be sustained, and the ecosystem collapsed. Not suddenly, not catastrophically, but irreversibly. We should spend some time exploring the geography of coal deposits around the world, because this geography tells us directly about the geography of the Carboniferous coal swamps and provides a tangible, physical connection between the ancient world and our own. The great coal deposits of the world are not randomly distributed. They are concentrated in specific regions, and when those regions are mapped and their geological history examined, they trace the outlines of the ancient Carboniferous coal swamps with remarkable precision. The oldest and most extensive coal deposits of Carboniferous age are found in a broad belt across what is now Europe and extending into parts of Asia. This belt includes the coalfields of Britain, the coalfields of Belgium, France, and Germany, the Donetsk Basin and other coalfields of Ukraine and Russia, and the Karaganda and Kuzbas basins of Kazakhstan and Siberia. These deposits all formed in the same great equatorial swamp that stretched across the northern continent during the Carboniferous, and they have been mined since the early Industrial Revolution. Similar Carboniferous coal deposits exist in China, which has some of the world's largest coal reserves. Much of the coal in these deposits is Carboniferous in age, formed in the coal swamps that occupied the equatorial and subtropical regions of the ancient Asian continent. In the southern hemisphere, the coal deposits are somewhat different in age and origin. The great coalfields of Australia, South Africa, and other parts of the former Gondwana supercontinent contain coal that is mostly Permian in age rather than Carboniferous, formed after the Gondwanan ice sheets had melted and the climate of the southern regions had warmed enough to support extensive forest growth. But these Permian coal deposits are the direct descendants of the Carboniferous tradition, formed by the same basic process of peat accumulation and coalification, just in a different geographical setting and a slightly different geological time. Every one of these coal deposits, wherever in the world it is found, is a direct legacy of the Carboniferous experiment. Each seam of coal is a bookmark in the geological record, marking a specific moment in the history of the coal swamps, a moment when the forests were growing and the peat was accumulating, and the carbon was being drawn down from the ancient air and locked away in the ground. Let us turn our attention now to some of the specific organisms of the Carboniferous that we have not yet discussed in detail, because the diversity of life in this period extends well beyond the lycopsids and the giant insects and the early reptiles. Among the most ecologically important groups of organisms in the Carboniferous were the fungi. We have discussed the absence of effective lignin-decomposing fungi as a key factor in coal formation, but the Carboniferous fungal community was far more diverse than this single negative capability suggests. Fungi played many roles in the Carboniferous ecosystem, and many of those roles were positive and essential. Mycorrhizal fungi, which form symbiotic relationships with plant roots, were almost certainly present during the Carboniferous. Mycorrhizal associations, in which the fungus provides the plant with mineral nutrients extracted from the soil in exchange for sugars produced by the plant's photosynthesis, are among the most important ecological relationships in terrestrial ecosystems. Most modern land plants, including the vast majority of trees, are dependent on mycorrhizal fungi for their nutrient supply. The evolution of this relationship is ancient, predating the Carboniferous, and it was almost certainly a key factor in the success of the Carboniferous forests. Other fungi in the Carboniferous were saprotrophic, breaking down dead organic material and recycling nutrients. While they could not efficiently break down lignin, they could decompose cellulose and other organic compounds, and their activity was essential for nutrient cycling in the forest ecosystem. Without fungi to break down some of the organic material falling to the forest floor, the nutrients contained in that material would have been locked away and unavailable to living plants. Even imperfect decomposition was better than no decomposition at all. There were also parasitic fungi, organisms that infected living plants and animals and derived nutrients from their hosts. Fungal parasites are a significant ecological force in modern ecosystems, influencing the dynamics of plant populations and playing a role in maintaining biodiversity by preventing any single species from becoming too dominant. They were almost certainly present in the Carboniferous as well, though their fossil record is sparse. The invertebrate community of the Carboniferous forest floor deserves more attention than it typically receives. We have discussed the giant arthropods, the Meganeura and the Arthropleura, but the vast majority of the invertebrate life in the coal swamp would have been much smaller and much less dramatic. Mites, collembola worms, and a host of other small invertebrates inhabited the peat and leaf litter, feeding on decaying organic material and on each other, breaking down organic matter, mixing the peat, and creating the channels and burrows that helped aerate the otherwise anaerobic swamp soil. These small organisms are rarely preserved in the fossil record because they lack the hard shells and mineral skeletons that fossilize readily. But where exceptional preservation conditions existed, as in certain amber deposits and fine-grained sediments, the microscopic community of the Carboniferous forest floor has been glimpsed, and it reveals a diversity and ecological complexity that rivals the diversity visible at the larger scale. The question of Carboniferous climate deserves more detailed treatment than we have given it so far, because the climate of the Carboniferous was not uniform. It varied both geographically and temporally, and those variations had important consequences for the organisms that lived through them. At the geographic level, the Carboniferous world showed strong climatic zonation from the equator to the poles. The equatorial regions, where the coal swamps were concentrated, were consistently hot and humid throughout the period. Moving toward the poles, the climate became progressively cooler, and during the glacial intervals, significantly colder, culminating in the ice sheets of Gondwana. Between the equatorial swamps and the polar ice, there were zones of intermediate climate, subtropical regions with alternating wet and dry seasons, temperate regions with more pronounced seasonality, subpolar regions that were cold in winter but warm in summer. Each of these climatic zones supported its own community of organisms, adapted to its specific conditions. At the temporal level, the Carboniferous climate fluctuated in response to both astronomical and geological forcing. The glacial cycles, driven by orbital variations in the Earth's movement around the Sun, caused repeated fluctuations in global temperature and sea level on timescales of tens to hundreds of thousands of years. Superimposed on these orbital cycles were longer-term changes driven by tectonics, the progressive assembly of Pangaea, the rise of mountains, the rearrangement of ocean basins. And over the entire span of the Carboniferous, there was the long-term trend toward cooler temperatures during the maximum carbon burial interval, and then a very gradual warming as coal formation slowed and carbon dioxide levels began to recover. The organisms that lived through the Carboniferous experienced this climate not as a geological abstraction, but as the daily and seasonal reality of their lives. The coal swamp trees grew in a climate that was warm and wet year-round, but even within that broadly stable framework there were variations, slightly wetter years and slightly drier years, unusually strong storms and unusually calm periods, years when the water table was a few inches higher or lower than average. These small variations, insignificant by geological standards, were the actual environment that individual plants and animals experienced, the specific, local, moment-to-moment reality of life in the Carboniferous. Now let us consider the evolutionary legacy of the Carboniferous, the long-term biological consequences of this extraordinary period for the trajectory of life on Earth. The most obvious evolutionary legacy of the Carboniferous is in the plant kingdom. The transition from lycopsid dominance to gymnosperm dominance that took place during the late Carboniferous and Permian established the basic framework of terrestrial vegetation that would persist, in various modifications, for the next 250 million years. Gymnosperms, particularly conifers, would dominate the terrestrial vegetation of the Mesozoic era, the age of dinosaurs, forming the great coniferous forests that covered much of the supercontinent Pangaea and its successor landmasses. The evolution of the seed, which was the key innovation that gave the gymnosperms their competitive advantage over the spore-bearing lycopsids and ferns, was a turning point in the history of plant evolution. Seeds enabled the colonization of dry habitats. They enabled the dispersal of plant offspring over long distances. They enabled the survival of embryos through unfavorable conditions. And they set the stage for the next great botanical revolution, the evolution of flowering plants. Flowering plants, the angiosperms, evolved during the Cretaceous period, roughly 140 million years ago, and they have come to dominate the terrestrial vegetation of the modern world. But they evolved from gymnosperm ancestors, building on the seed-plant body plan that was first established in the Carboniferous. The flowers, fruits, and diverse pollination and dispersal mechanisms of the angiosperms are elaborations on the basic seed-plant theme that the Carboniferous gymnosperms pioneered. So in a very real sense, every flowering plant in the modern world, every rose and oak and grass and orchid, is a descendant of the botanical revolution that the Carboniferous set in motion. The seeds you plant in your garden, the flowers you admire in a field, the fruit you eat for breakfast, all of these are expressions of an evolutionary trajectory whose beginning can be traced to the forests of the Carboniferous. The vertebrate legacy of the Carboniferous is equally profound. The evolution of the amniotic egg, which took place during the Carboniferous, was the key event that freed vertebrate animals from their dependence on water for reproduction. Without the amniotic egg, there would be no reptiles, no birds, no mammals. There would be at most a world of amphibians and fish, and the extraordinary diversity of terrestrial vertebrate life that we know today would simply not exist. Every mammal that has ever lived, from the tiny, insectivorous creatures of the Mesozoic to the great whales and elephants of the modern world, carries within its biology the legacy of the Carboniferous amniotic revolution. The amnion, the membrane that gives amniotes their name, wraps every mammalian embryo in its mother's womb, performing the same function for the developing embryo that the shell and membranes of a reptile egg perform, isolating the embryo from the external environment and creating the controlled, protected internal environment that is necessary for vertebrate development. The human body is, in this sense, a direct descendant of the Carboniferous. The egg that eventually became you, the embryo that developed in the protected, aqueous environment of a mother's womb, is connected by an unbroken lineage to the first amniotic eggs laid in the hollows of fallen lycopsid stumps 300 million years ago. We are, biologically, children of the Carboniferous. Let us also consider the atmospheric legacy of the Carboniferous, because the effects of Carboniferous carbon burial on the composition of the atmosphere have lasted, in various forms, to the present day. The carbon that the Carboniferous forests removed from the atmosphere is still mostly locked away in the coal seams. Over the hundreds of millions of years since the Carboniferous, some of this coal has been exposed by erosion and has slowly oxidized back into carbon dioxide. Some has been subducted into the mantle along with the oceanic crust that rode over it, but most of it is still there, still underground, still holding the carbon that the ancient plants captured from the ancient air. If you take all the coal that has ever been mined and all the coal that still remains in the ground, and if you calculate how much carbon dioxide would be released if all of it were burned, the number is staggering. It represents a significant fraction of the total carbon dioxide that was in the Carboniferous atmosphere before the forests began their work. Burning all of it would substantially raise the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, with consequences for the global climate that are not difficult to imagine. We are, of course, in the process of burning some of this coal. The industrial use of coal over the past 2.5 centuries has already released significant quantities of ancient Carboniferous carbon into the atmosphere. Every power plant, every steel mill, every steam engine that has ever burned coal has been contributing, in a small way, to the reversal of the process that the Carboniferous forests accomplished over tens of millions of years. The geological timescale and the human timescale are, in this context, in stark and sobering contrast. As we approach the final stages of our documentary, let us consider what the Carboniferous period teaches us about the nature of Earth itself, as a planet, as a system, as a home for life. The Carboniferous is often presented as an unusual period, an anomaly in Earth's history characterized by conditions that were extreme by the standards of the modern world. High oxygen, low carbon dioxide, giant insects, endless swamps, and in some respects this characterization is accurate. The Carboniferous was indeed extreme, a high point in certain atmospheric parameters that has not been matched before or since. But the Carboniferous was also deeply normal, in the sense that it was simply the Earth doing what the Earth does, responding to the forces acting upon it, adjusting its chemistry and climate in response to geological, biological, and astronomical inputs, finding a dynamic equilibrium and then losing it as conditions changed, and finding a new equilibrium. The Earth is not a static, passive backdrop for the drama of life. It is an active, dynamic system, constantly cycling materials through its atmosphere, oceans, crust, and mantle, constantly adjusting to the interplay of forces that act upon it. The Carboniferous is a particularly vivid example of this dynamism because the biological component of the Earth system was so powerful during that period. The lycopsid forests were not passive recipients of the environment they inhabited. They were active agents of change, profoundly altering the atmosphere, the soils, the climate, the hydrology, and the biology of the world they lived in. They remade their world through the sheer force of their growth and their death. This is something that Earth scientists have come to appreciate more and more deeply over the past few decades, that life is not just a passenger on the Earth system, but a driver of it. Life has been altering the planet's atmosphere since the first photosynthetic organisms evolved more than 2.5 billion years ago. Life has shaped the soils, the sediments, the rock record, the distribution of elements in the crust. Life and the physical Earth are not separate systems that interact at the margins. They are deeply, fundamentally entangled, co-evolving, co-creating the world we live in. The Carboniferous is one of the most dramatic expressions of this entanglement in the entire history of the Earth. The forests and the atmosphere, the organisms and the environment were locked in a dance of mutual transformation that lasted for 60 million years and left permanent marks on the planet. The coal in the ground is a monument to this dance. The oxygen in the air we breathe today still carries, in modified form, the legacy of the Carboniferous forest's extraordinary productivity. The seed plants that dominate the modern world are the evolutionary heirs of the Carboniferous botanical revolution. The vertebrate animals that fill every terrestrial ecosystem, including the one that reads and thinks and wonders about the deep past, are the descendants of the amniotic revolution that took place in the hollows of Carboniferous tree stumps. The end of the Carboniferous was, as we have discussed, a gradual affair, a slow fading rather than a sudden extinction. But it is worth reflecting on what was lost when the great coal swamps disappeared. Not just the biological diversity of the lycopsid forests, though that was real and significant, not just the particular ecosystem services that the coal swamps provided, but something more intangible, more philosophical. The coal swamp world was a world of extraordinary fecundity and productivity, a world where the interaction of warm temperatures, abundant moisture, and prolific plant growth created an ecosystem of staggering biological intensity. The sheer volume of life that poured through those swamps, the tonnage of biomass produced every year, every decade, every century, the density and diversity of organisms from the microscopic fungi and bacteria in the peat to the 100-foot lycopsid giants overhead, was something that the world has not seen in quite the same way since. The forests that dominate the modern world are diverse and productive, but they are different in character from the coal swamp. They are drier, more seasonal, more varied in their structure and composition. They are not built around a single dominant group of plants in the way the coal swamp was built around the lycopsids. They are more resilient in some ways, more susceptible in others. They are the product of 250 million years of additional evolution and ecological reorganization since the coal swamps disappeared. The Carboniferous coal swamp was a unique moment in the history of life on Earth, a moment that will not come again. The conditions that created it, the particular combination of geography, climate, atmospheric chemistry, and biological evolution, existed for a specific, bounded interval of geological time, and then were gone. The coal that remains is its only physical legacy, compressed remnants of a world that was alive and green and teeming with life for tens of millions of years before it vanished into the geological past. There is something deeply moving about this if we allow ourselves to feel it. The Carboniferous coal swamps existed. They were real. For 60 million years, longer than the entire span of time that has elapsed since the dinosaurs died, those forests grew and died and grew again in the warm, wet, equatorial lowlands of the ancient Earth. The insects flew through their canopies, the amphibians lurked in their waterways, the early reptiles sheltered in their fallen trunks. The peat piled up beneath them, layer after layer after layer, and then it ended, not with a bang, not with a disaster, but with the slow, inexorable change of circumstances, the drift of continents, the rise of mountains, the drying of climate. The last lycopsid forests shrank to remnants, then disappeared. The last great peat deposits were buried, compressed, and transformed. The world moved on to new forms, new ecosystems, new evolutionary innovations, but the Carboniferous was not erased, it was transformed. Its carbon became coal. Its soil became the foundation of later terrestrial ecosystems. Its evolutionary innovations, the amniotic egg, the seed, the high-oxygen adapted arthropod body plan, became the building blocks of everything that followed. It ended, but it did not disappear. It became part of the substrate of the world, invisible but essential, present in every piece of coal and in every breath of slightly elevated oxygen, and in every vertebrate embryo wrapped in its amniotic membranes. The story of the Carboniferous period is, in the end, a story about transformation. It is a story about how life transforms the physical world and how the physical world transforms life. It is a story about how today's ordinary becomes tomorrow's extraordinary, how the slow accumulation of small changes can, over geological time, produce results that are staggering in their scale and consequence. It is also a story about interconnection. The lycopsid trees and the atmospheric oxygen and the giant insects and the early reptiles and the Gondwanan ice sheets and the sea level cycles and the coal deposits and the modern industrial civilization that burns that coal are not separate stories. They are one story, a single, long, complex narrative of cause and effect playing out across hundreds of millions of years. Understanding any part of this story requires understanding its connections to all the other parts. And it is a story about time. About deep time, the vast, almost incomprehensible spans of time that geological processes require to accomplish their work. 60 million years for the Carboniferous forests to lay down their coal deposits. Hundreds of millions of years for that coal to be buried, compressed, and matured. A few centuries for an industrial civilization to extract and burn a significant fraction of it. The asymmetry between the timescale of creation and the timescale of consumption is one of the most striking features of the coal story, and it invites reflection on the relationship between human actions and geological time. As we draw toward the close of this documentary, let us spend a few moments with the scientists who have devoted their careers to understanding the Carboniferous period, because the story we have told is not a finished story. It is an ongoing investigation, with new discoveries being made, new techniques being applied, new questions being asked and answered. Paleobotanists study the fossil plants of the Carboniferous, working to understand the diversity, anatomy, ecology, and evolutionary relationships of the organisms that built the coal swamps. They cut open coal balls and examine the microscopic structure of ancient plant tissues. They study the patterns of leaf venation and spore morphology in compression fossils. They reconstruct the three-dimensional architecture of ancient forests using the spatial distribution of fossil plant parts in ancient sediments. Paleoentomologists study the fossil insects, working to understand the diversity and ecology of the arthropod community that filled the high oxygen atmosphere of the Carboniferous. They examine the wing venation patterns of fossil griffinflies, the body proportions of fossil millipedes, the mouthpart structures of fossil cockroaches, using these details to infer the behavior, diet, and ecological relationships of animals that lived 300 million years ago. Vertebrate paleontologists study the fossil tetrapods, tracing the evolutionary lineages of the early amphibians and reptiles that lived in and around the coal swamps. They examine the bone structure and dentition of ancient skulls, looking for the subtle anatomical features that reveal evolutionary relationships and ecological roles. They reconstruct the locomotion, feeding strategies, and reproductive biology of animals that left only their bones and occasional trackways in the rock record. Geochemists analyze the isotopic composition of ancient rocks and fossils, extracting information about the temperature, chemistry, and gas composition of the ancient atmosphere and ocean. They develop and refine models of the ancient carbon cycle, trying to quantify the fluxes of carbon between the atmosphere, biosphere, and lithosphere during the Carboniferous. Molecular biologists and evolutionary geneticists analyze the genomes of living organisms, constructing molecular phylogenies and molecular clocks that allow them to estimate when specific evolutionary events occurred and how specific biochemical capabilities evolved. The molecular clock analysis that suggested white rot fungi evolved their lignin-degrading enzymes near the end of the Carboniferous is a product of this kind of research. Together, these scientists are building an ever more detailed and nuanced picture of the Carboniferous world. The picture we have drawn in this documentary is a snapshot of current scientific understanding, but it is a snapshot that is constantly being revised and refined as new evidence is gathered and new analytical techniques are developed. There are still many open questions about the Carboniferous. The exact timing and magnitude of the atmospheric oxygen peak during the Carboniferous remains a subject of scientific debate, with different models and different proxy data suggesting somewhat different values. The exact role of lignin-degrading fungi in the termination of coal formation is still being investigated, with some researchers questioning the simple version of the story that has become popular in media accounts. The evolutionary relationships among some of the major Carboniferous plant groups remain uncertain, as does the detailed phylogeny of many of the vertebrate and invertebrate animals. The causes and precise timing of the Carboniferous rainforest collapse are still being studied, with ongoing debate about the relative contributions of climate change, sea level change, and biological evolution to the decline of the lycopsid-dominated ecosystems. The mechanisms by which the gymnosperms spread from their upland refugia into the lowlands formerly occupied by the coal swamps are not fully understood. The complex interplay between the Gondwanan glaciation and the tropical coal swamp ecosystems is still being worked out. These open questions are not signs of ignorance or failure. They are signs of a living science, a field of inquiry that is actively advancing, where each new discovery generates new questions and each new technique reveals new layers of complexity in an already complex story. The Carboniferous, for all that we know about it, still holds secrets, still has surprises in store for the scientists who spend their careers interrogating its fossil record and its rock chemistry. As we reach the end of this documentary, let us return one final time to the coal swamps, to stand in imagination among the lycopsid giants and breathe the oxygen-rich air and listen to the hum of giant insect wings, because this is where the story began and this is where it finds its deepest meaning. The forests of the Carboniferous were not trying to change the world. They were not engaged in any purposeful project of atmospheric transformation or carbon burial. They were simply doing what living things do, growing toward the light, drawing nutrients from the soil, reproducing, dying, decaying imperfectly in the waterlogged swamps that were their home. The world-transforming consequences of all this ordinary biological activity were emergent properties, results that arose from the interaction of billions of individual organisms with their physical environment over tens of millions of years. This is, perhaps, the deepest lesson of the Carboniferous. That transformation does not require intention. That world-changing consequences can emerge from the simple, ordinary business of living and dying. That the most profound effects in the history of the Earth have often been produced not by dramatic events or sudden catastrophes, but by the slow, quiet, cumulative work of organisms going about their daily lives across geological time. The lycopsids were not heroes. They were not villains. They were not trying to save the world or destroy it. They were just trees growing in a swamp doing what trees do, and in doing so they made the world. The same is true of the white rot fungi that eventually evolved the ability to break down lignin, ending the great coal-forming epoch. They were not trying to stop coal formation. They were just fungi evolving new enzymes doing what fungi do. And in doing so, they changed the course of the world's carbon cycle and ultimately helped bring the age of the coal swamps to an end. This perspective, the perspective of emergence and unintended consequence, of world-scale change arising from individual-scale biology, is one of the most important insights that geology and evolutionary biology have to offer. It puts human agency in a different context, neither inflating it to cosmic significance nor dismissing it as irrelevant. It suggests that we are part of a much larger story, a story that began billions of years before us and will continue long after us. A story in which our own actions, however extraordinary they may seem to us, are part of the same basic process of living organisms interacting with their physical environment and producing consequences that ripple outward through time and space. The coal beneath our feet, the oxygen in our lungs, the seed plants that feed us and shelter us, the amniotic membranes that protected each of us in our earliest development, these are not coincidences or accidents. They are the accumulated products of 350 million years of life on Earth, building, destroying, transforming, adapting, going extinct, and diversifying again. The Carboniferous period is one of the most important chapters in this long story, a chapter in which the pace of change was high, the stakes were enormous, and the consequences have proven to be among the most enduring in the history of our planet. When you next encounter a piece of coal in a museum exhibit or a geological sample or perhaps in a more traditional setting, take a moment to hold it and think about what it is. It is not just a rock, it is a record. It is the compressed autobiography of an ancient world, written in carbon and squeezed by time into a dense, black, energy-rich stone. It contains in coded form the story of lycopsid trees 100 feet tall, of oxygen levels that made dragonflies grow to the size of hawks, of ice sheets on the southern continent and tropical swamps on the equator, of the first reptiles and the last giant insects, of a world in the process of making itself into the world we know. It is ancient sunlight, captured by ancient leaves, stored in ancient peat, compressed by ancient mountains of sediment, and delivered to us across 300 million years of geological time. It is a gift from the Carboniferous, and like all gifts, it comes with a history and a meaning that goes far beyond its immediate practical value. The Carboniferous period was a time of extraordinary productivity, creativity, and transformation. It was the age when forests first truly conquered the land, when the atmosphere was remade by biological processes, when the foundations of the modern world were laid down in the warm, wet swamps of the equatorial lowlands. It lasted 60 million years, a span of time so vast that it dwarfs all of recorded human history many times over, and yet it was not the beginning and not the end. It was one chapter in the long, still unfinished story of life on Earth. The chapter that preceded it, the Devonian, had laid the groundwork, the first forests, the first tetrapods, the first soils. The chapter that followed it, the Permian, would extend some of its legacies and destroy others, culminating in the greatest mass extinction in the history of complex life. And the chapters that came after the Permian would build on the ruins of what the extinction had destroyed, the world of dinosaurs and mammals, and eventually, after another 180 million years of geological history, the world we know today. The Carboniferous is not separate from all of this. It is woven through it, a thread of coal and oxygen and evolutionary innovation running from the ancient swamps to the modern world, connecting the deep past to the living present in ways that are invisible but fundamental, hidden but real. We are children of the Carboniferous. We breathe its oxygen. We burn its coal. We walk on soils that its forests helped to create. We carry in our biology the innovations that evolved in its swamps. We are, in a very real and profound sense, the product of those ancient forests, the inheritors of their work, the beneficiaries of their slow, patient, world-transforming labor. The forests are long gone. The swamps have dried and changed. The lycopsids survive only as humble, foot-tall club mosses in the damp corners of modern forests. The dragonflies are gone, their giant wings folded forever, their bodies turned to stone in the rock record. The giant millipedes have vanished. The equatorial coal swamps that stretched for thousands of miles across the ancient Earth have been reduced to seams of black rock beneath the surface. But their legacy endures. It endures in the carbon stored in the coal. It endures in the oxygen that fills our lungs. It endures in the seed plants that feed the world. It endures in the amniotic membranes that protect every developing vertebrate embryo. It endures, compressed and ancient and indestructible, in the black seams of rock that lie beneath the surface of the Earth, waiting, as they have waited for 300 million years, to be understood. This was the Carboniferous period. This was the age when forests ruled the Earth, and this, in every sense that matters, is where our world began. Thank you for joining us on this extraordinary journey through deep time. The story of the Carboniferous period is one of the most remarkable chapters in the history of our planet, a story of transformation, resilience, and enduring legacy. If you found this documentary compelling, please share it with others who might be moved by the deep history of the world we call home. And do not forget to subscribe to the channel so you will be among the first to know when our next journey into the past begins. The Earth has many more extraordinary stories to tell, and we will be here to tell them.